This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome everyone to the Police and Crime Committee meeting. This morning we will be holding our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. We haven't received any apologies to today's meeting.
Thank you, Lauren. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? No, I'll take silence as a no. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of February, 6th of March and the 22nd of May to be signed by me as correct records?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we note the recent actions taken by the former chair of the Police and Crime Committee under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members as listed in the agenda report?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we note the responses to committee outputs, the joint response from the committee from the Metropolitan Police Service, NHS London and the London Ambulance Service to the committee's letter on mental health and policing, and the response from Transport for London to the committee's report on the police investigation of serious injury collisions?
Noted.
Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our guest, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. I was told that you wanted to specifically say something, which I think is not correct. I will go straight into the questions, and anything one of my colleagues wanted to ask can be wound into there, I'm sure. Okay, so we are starting on questions for public order policing. The Mayor ordered a high-level review of the arrests made at the coronation in May 2023. The Met has committed to making conclusions from the review public. However, the Met does not appear to have yet published these findings. So when will these findings be published? Has MOPAC seen the findings, and if so, could you share them with the committee?
Thanks a lot. I think the premise that the Mayor ordered a high-level review is not quite correct, because actually one of the things that the Metropolitan Police always do after protests or major policing operations is to review, to actually have that debrief and to have a review, which we were very pleased that was happening. In terms of that actual review, no, we have not yet had the on paper high-level findings that have been promised. My understanding is that some legal proceedings have made that more difficult to bring it to pass over to us. However, I have had regular bilateral meetings with Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist, and we have discussed some of the findings and some of the issues and some of the learnings around communication between officers on the ground, and also communication between the council as well. But we are waiting to get those headline findings over to us.
And have we got any timeline on that at all?
No, I haven't.
Because it's a year. So will you commit then to pushing them along and finding out why we haven't got that?
Yes, and we have been asking for it. It's not that we've not been asking for it, we haven't forgotten. We have had conversations about some of the high-level findings, as I said, around communication on the ground between those officers, frontline officers, the command above it, and also with the council, because that was one of the issues, wasn't it, that was coming out from the coronation policing. But of course, we'll continue to ask for those high-level findings, and when we get them, we've asked for them to be in a form that are publishable because of the public interest in this.
Yeah, I mean, how long do you think you'll give them until you're irritated by it, as we are indeed?
I would have expected to have received that already.
So when the Met doesn't give information, and this has happened on various occasions before, you're asked the questions, and to be fair, if you don't have the answers, you don't. What levers can you push or pull in order that we start getting some answers from the Metropolitan Police?
So they have a statutory duty to provide the information. My understanding is that because of legal proceedings, the information is not appropriate to be published at the moment. So when that's possible, I would expect it to come over, and that we'll be able to publish that. They do have a statutory duty to provide information that has been asked for.
They do.
But there are no follow-up powers, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that's basically what I was asking. Okay, well, we'll continue to ask you. I'm sure you'll continue to ask them. During the committee's question and answer on public order policing on the 7th of June 2023, you told the committee that MOPAC had asked the Met to keep it regularly updated on the use of Public Order Act 2023. How does the Met do this, and what are the main findings the Met is sharing with MOPAC, and what impact has the Public Order Act 2023 had on the Met's policing protests?
Thanks a lot. I mean, we did have extensive discussions about the Public Order Act, and rightly, because the powers were brought in very quickly, weren't they, before the coronation, and that was one of the issues that was problematic in terms of communication and individual officers understanding the powers that are within the Act. I have had regular discussions around Public Order Act with Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist. What they have told me, that whilst there's a real focus on the Public Order Act 2023, the advice that we get from the Met is actually when they are policing the protests, they rely more heavily on using the powers under the 1986 Public Order Act, and very much so using those powers in the policing of the protests in London since October the 7th, I think we've discussed before, and I think the Commissioner has also discussed this in front of the committee, that they have been very proactive and assertive in the use of powers in terms of the imposition of conditions under the Public Order Act 1986, which is on the protests, conditions about where they start. We're talking about the protests post October the 7th, about where they start, where they end, and also around dispersal. They have been very robust and proactive, but actually those powers are under the 1986 Act rather than the 2023 Act.
Right. I mean, has your view that some of the additional powers which the Public Order Act gave the Met, you said that they weren't welcomed, have your views on that changed, or are you going to be looking or asking the new government to see if they can change these things back?
My view of the powers hasn't changed. I think what I said previously when we discussed this is that I think we ought to be looking at reviewing the powers and how they have been used, because actually there are some useful powers within that Act. It's not the whole Act that's a problem. So that hasn't changed, but I think we do need to have a review, and that's about a national review look at this, not necessarily a full, I at the time thought perhaps an inspection, possibly that's the best thing, but actually there has, the previous one, I can't remember if it's the previous Home Secretary, no, it wouldn't have been, it would have been a couple of Home Secretaries before that, commissioned HMIC FRS to look at activism and impartiality in policing. There was a interim, sort of not publication, but interim findings around that from HMRC FRS in January, and I don't know when the final report is going to be published. I think that will help in terms of understanding how the Public Order Act 2023 has been used, as well as looking at the Equality Act, hate crime, advisory groups, and also political influence.
Okay, thank you. Have powers which expand stop and search to protest-related activity been used by the Met? And if so, how often and in what context?
So the powers around stop and search, which was ability for items related to sort of specific protest-related offences such as lock-on, and some of that I think we've discussed before about being not totally clear about what that means and doesn't mean. They have been used. I don't have the figures for how often they've been used, but obviously you can get back to you on that.
If you would, please. I think it was lock-on you weren't happy about, wasn't it?
It's the powers around stop and search with no suspicion that was the problem. In terms of lock-on, some of those powers are probably are welcome because it's a specific problem. around some of the protests that were taking place and have taken place.
It certainly is. Well, I'm glad to hear that you approve of those. I certainly do. Has the Met used powers in the Public Order Act 2023 to issue serious disruption prevention orders related to protest activity? And if so, how many orders have been used and in what context?
I haven't got the figures for how often they've used that. As I've said before, they rely more heavily on the 1986 Act rather than the 2023 Act, but I haven't got those figures.
If you have or are able to get hold of those, perhaps you'll send those to the committee. Thank you. Zoe.
Thank you. I was just going to ask specifically about a section of the Public Order Act and whether it worries you, the use of the illegal to conspire section that we obviously saw used in the time of the coronation around the Animal Rising arrests in Hackney, and we've seen the use of that increasing over the last year. I just wondered, if that worries you in terms of their use of the illegal to conspire and where that power is being scrutinised, because it obviously is a huge widening of police surveillance, whether that's animal rights protesters or ULEZ protesters, and just I'm wondering where that additional surveillance is being scrutinised.
So I think that's part of what I've been talking about in terms of the need for more wide, a look at how the 2023 Act has been implemented and has been used, not just by the Metropolitan Police, but by policing in general. Because although obviously London gets very much the lion's share of the protests, it's not the only place that gets the protests. So, for example, yesterday I was talking to another Police and Crime Commissioner who was asking for advice around what do you do when there's large-scale protests, because there was going to be a large-scale protest in their force, and that was a new Police and Crime Commissioner. I think it's important that there is that review. In terms of those powers, it will be really important that we understand how they're used, whether they're proportionately used, and was the right intelligence. So it's going to be it will be difficult to get a fully transparent review, because I think some of that will be about intelligence as well. I don't have the figures for how often it's been used, as I said previously, because the Met are telling me that they rely more heavily on the 1986 Act.
Thanks. Yeah, because it would just be really good to understand the criteria that they use and who they put into the section of being someone who they think is illegally conspiring. And I think it's really important to have a really clear understanding of what that criteria is, because I think that's a terrifying widening of police surveillance. So did you say that would be part of the review?
No, I was saying I think it should be part of a review of the powers, and perhaps that's what HMIC FRS are looking at. I don't know, but I do think it's important, given the public interest in this, that people have confidence that those powers are being used properly, and they have confidence that across the country that policing are using those powers properly and proportionately.
Yeah, and if they're on a list or not, I think people would be interested to find out. Thank you.
Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, what impact is the policing of protests having on the Met's budget now, what you can see in the future, and what do you think is needed to address this?
So I think that's one of the key issues for the Metropolitan Police at the moment, and as I said, we get the lion's share of protests in London. Since October the 7th, the Met have estimated that between October the 7th and the 9th of June, there's been 51,799 officer shifts connected to protests or vigils in the London area. That's a huge number of police officers being abstracted from their local neighbourhood policing, abstracted from communities. But they've also had 9,639 shifts completed by officers on mutual aid. So not only is there a burden on our own local Metropolitan Police officers, there's also, and we're thankful for other forces lending their officers and coming into London to do that protesting. But again, that is a burden for other forces. And that has cost the estimate of the cost of the Met of that period from October the 7th to the 9th of June is £42.9 million cost. That includes £27 million of opportunity costs. So we're talking about the opportunity cost of police officers who aren't doing their normal business as usual jobs in the communities or whatever specialist units they have been in. Now that, I think, the figures are stark and it is quite a burden, but I think it's also, from my experience of what those protests, it is also a burden not only on the individual officers who are having to work longer shifts and not being in their neighbourhoods, but it is also a burden on the senior leadership of the Met because it takes up a lot of senior officer time. There is risk involved in policing protests. It is difficult. The Met are very, very experienced at it, and I do think think they are very experienced in and have been policing the protests extremely well in London, and really trying their best to have the balance between the right to protest, the right to free speech, and also protecting communities against, protecting communities when they feel fearful. And we know, and we've discussed that many times here, about some of the unintended consequences of some of the protests. But I think, one of the things I was going to say is that I think in terms of the difference that it's going to be with a new government in place around policing of the protests, is I genuinely think that we will no longer have a government that is whipping up division, whipping up hate, and also, throwing the Metropolitan Police under the bus when they are trying their best and using all their experience and expertise to police London, and doing so effectively.
Thank you. We recognise that the current amount that the Met receives from the National and International Cities grant doesn't accurately reflect the huge spike in major protests that London has seen over the past year, which you've spoken about. Will the Mayor's office continue to lobby the new government for an increase in that grant?
I mean, as I've said, in terms of having a new government in that is going to be more supportive rather than attacking the Metropolitan Police, I think that's fantastic. We're 2 weeks tomorrow into the new government. King's speech is going to be happening at 11:30. So yes, of course, given the context of the austerity, the cuts that have had to, and the underfunding, of course, funding is part of the discussions that we'll be having with the new government. And we've been very clear, as has Mark, has been very clear about the burden that London being the capital city places on the Metropolitan Police.
Thank you. Moving on to football, topical issue. Last year, the Met spent £18.5 million policing because Premier League matches, policing Premier League matches because of a legal loophole, which means that clubs aren't financially responsible for officers that aren't on the actual grounds. Will you work with the Commissioner and the Mayor to lobby Premier League clubs to pay their fair share?
Yes, of course, and it is an issue, isn't it, around the the large number, which is great for football supporters, the large number of Premier League clubs as well as league clubs in London. It's not just the Premier League clubs, of course, but of course they attract the greatest number of police, greatest policing presence. Of course, we'll continue to work with the Met around how the Premier League can pay more and a fairer share. A couple of months before the general election, the Premier League did, I'm sorry, it's from memory this, they did give a certain amount of money to policing nationally to make up some of that shortfall around the policing of Premier League and policing of football. From memory, I think that was £7 million nationally. The Met were going to get a slice of that. I can't quite remember what that slice was. So there is some movement.
How are those conversations with the clubs going?
That's a conversation that is held with the Metropolitan Police in terms of the Premier League clubs, and we haven't yet made progress in terms of a actual formula as to how that will work.
Okay, all right, thank you. Reinforcing the need for proper resourcing to police football matches. June's 2024 Champions League final at Wembley saw masses of people break onto the stadium and a pitch invader, which resulted in 53 arrests. This is a repeat of the events that we saw at the 2020 Euros final. What is being done to avoid this sort of these events happening again at these big stage events?
So there's a huge amount of work that goes into those major set-piece events, such as the Champions League final. I don't think it was a repeat of what happened previously with the real pitch invasions, and there were some difficulties, but it wasn't the same. I think so. My understanding was that actually the sort of lines of defence, a couple were broken, but actually it was, yes, there was a little bit of trouble, but it was nothing like what happened at Wembley, which is of course a subject to the Baroness Casey, subject to her review. I know that there was a lot of discussions, not only between the Metropolitan Police, DCMS, and City, well, not between the Metropolitan Police and DCMS, but also with City Hall, around making sure that the lessons learnt from the Louise Casey review were applied to the Champions League final and are applied to all major events.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I to start with say to you that saying that the government stirred up hatred is completely and utterly wrong, and to say that they didn't support the Metropolitan Police is also wrong. I had many conversations with James Cleverly latterly, and he was very supportive. So I think actually coming up with comments like that when there's nobody here to defend it and to say you're wrong is completely outrageous. The one figure I do want from you, because I agree with you that more money should come to the Met through the NIC funding. Exactly how much money is the Mayor asking the government for NIC funding?
So the Commissioner and ourselves have been on record as to what we think the shortfall of funding is around the National International Capital Cities grant, and also the fact that it was refreshed or reviewed in terms of the 2015 had the review. The figure was in terms of is a £240 million funding shortfall.
So hopefully the new government will give you £240 million.
As I said, we're 2 weeks in, just about 2 weeks into the new government. We will obviously be having discussions with them, and funding will be part of those discussions, of course.
Well, I sincerely hope that they give it to him, because he's made much of it, and I have tried to get more money too for that, because I agree we need more money, so let's see how he does with that. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks, Chair. Sophie, what impact is the continued under-recruitment of officers having for those officers already working within the Met, and the large amount of overtime and cancelled rest days? How is MOPAC monitoring that, and what impact is there?
So we obviously monitor, as I've got the figures and said already this morning, we monitor the shifts around protests. We know that, and we're all well aware of the recruitment challenges the Metropolitan Police have got, and we are well aware of the Police Uplift programme target not being met because of those challenges around recruitment. It does have an impact on individual officers because of the shifts that they work. It does have an impact on the ability to be flexible, and it does have an impact on, for example, abstractions. The way that we monitor that is, one is looking at abstractions. Before October the 7th, for example, the Deputy Commissioner, I believe, Gareth, you were actually in the meeting previously, the Deputy Commissioner discussed with leaders of boroughs around the abstraction rate to really try and monitor it. And pre-October the 7th, they were getting a grip with the abstraction rate, and it had fallen by about 14%, I think. Post-October the 7th, that abstraction rate, as we all know, and you will know from discussions with your communities, that abstraction rate has risen. We also, as part of budget monitoring, we look at the overtime budget and the, how much of a pressure there is within the overtime budget, which is perennially overspent.
Thanks. That's monitoring, obviously, the abstractions, but in terms of the morale, in terms of the human cost of this, what is being done to understand that within the Met?
I think part of that is about the abstractions and the monitoring of the abstractions. The Metropolitan Police takes that very seriously. But in terms of morale, the Met are, regularly meeting with the staff support associations and the Federation as well to discuss what is happening. I met with the Federation last week and discussed morale with them about the burden of, what is happening, and the burden and the pressure that is on frontline policing. And it is, we can't underestimate that burden and that pressure on the frontline policing. So we are also, and my understanding as well is that the Metropolitan Police are planning a staff survey to really understand in terms of what their staff and officers are feeling and what is happening there. But they also have pulse surveys that they also do on a regular occasion. I think that they're going to do the staff survey next in the autumn.
And what is it that people say to you? What is it that you heard in that meeting?
I hear that, in terms of what I've said already is the burden and pressure on officers of being abstracted from their, the jobs that they normally do, the long hours that they have to work, and the difficulty that places on their own. Everybody has different work-life balances, everybody has different pressures and caring responsibilities, but it does place a burden on them, and that's what I hear in terms of officers when I talk to them. And I discussed morale with the Federation last week.
And so when it comes to those missing 1,400 officers, obviously we know now the Mayor has made a commitment that if elected and if a Labour government is elected, there will be 1,300 new police. How are we going to do that if we couldn't even make the recruitment target before? And morale, as you've heard, is so low within the Met. And it almost does seem exclusive to the Met when you look at other forces. There's a very exclusive problem here that has to be recognised.
I'm not sure that morale is exclusive to the Met. There's been national federation surveys about how police officers are feeling, about the impact of the cost of living and their ability to pay their bills. So that is not exclusive to the Met. I'm not pretending that the recruitment challenges isn't a particular issue in London, as we've discussed previously about those recruitment challenges across the public sector, from nurses, teachers, probation officers being ever really difficult in terms of recruitment challenges. We are doing all we can to support the Met in terms of their recruitment. They will be launching a new recruitment campaign very, very shortly. We are doing all we can from City Hall to support that through our own networks, through our community networks, through the, everybody that we know through further education and skills and those networks. We are absolutely going to be supporting that. And when that recruitment campaign comes out, it'd be really good if you, as Assembly members with the reach that you have, encourage your communities to apply to the Metropolitan Police. It's an important campaign, and we are hopeful that it will be, it will make a difference in terms of attracting people to apply to the Metropolitan Police.
I just think to not recognise that there is an exclusively dire problem in the Met in comparison to, on top of the other challenges faced by police officers across the country, there is a very exclusive problem here in terms of the abstractions, the level of abuse, and obviously the cost of living challenges. And I think that you have to understand that that is very exclusive to the Met and needs to be dealt with. And I don't think we can get to grips with recruitment until that's acknowledged. But even with that said, what has been the lessons learned from the failure of the last recruitment to make sure that's addressed this time?
So the Met have done a lot of research in terms of what, in terms of what their new recruitment campaign is going to be, should be focusing on and looking at in terms of the key messages. I mean, we've had a discussion previously around their previous campaign, which was very much sort of a action-packed campaign around helicopters, speeding cars. The next campaign is not looking like that. They're going to be launching it very shortly, so I hope you will see that there has been a shift and a look at really understanding what might attract people to the jobs within the Metropolitan Police. And of course, it is a brilliant career and a brilliant profession to be in. I'm not denying that there are issues in the Metropolitan Police. Of course I'm not. Of course there's there's issues, but there are issues nationally with policing as well. And it would be wrong to not acknowledge that. I think in terms of London, there's unique things around London. It's not just unique to the Metropolitan Police. There's the cost of living, there's the pay and the cost of living, which is obviously attached to pay, an important marker. The Commissioner's talked, and I have talked previously about the importance of paying officers in London what they need so we can attract them to not only apply to the Met, but to stay in the Met because they can afford to settle here, raise their families, and their work-life balance is such that they can actually continue to, do their job as policing and be able to have a work-life balance. That's really, really important. Mark has also done, the Commissioner has also done all he can in terms of course, this is again about learning the lessons about increasing London waiting. He took a decision about 18 months to 2 years ago to increase the London waiting to 2,000 to the top bit that he could within the current framework to £2,000 to attract and also to retain people. So there are, there's lessons learned, there are decisions being making to improve the attraction of the Met, but also improve the retention within the Met as well.
And so will you be supporting the Police Federation as they look to move to collective bargaining as opposed to fixed pay award?
I think it's important that we have the National Police Pay Review Body. I've given evidence to the National Police Pay Review Body, I'm hoping, I don't know when they're going to report, but I'm hoping that they've taken into consideration the evidence that we have put forward, as well as the Metropolitan Police has put forward, for the need for police officers to be paid properly for the job that they do in London.
And so you don't support the collective bargaining? Cool.
I think the Police Pay Review Body is there to do its job, and at the moment I'd have to be convinced that it needed to change.
And you've written as well to the new government on this as well, I'm guessing.
I've not written. We've written to the new government on specifics around this. We've obviously written to the new government to say there's many issues that we need to discuss. But let's be clear, tomorrow is 2 weeks in for the new government. There's been 14 years of cuts, 14 years of austerity. The new government is not going to be able to just turn that around, with a switch of a light switch, putting a light switch on, and then everything is going to be all right, because they have got huge problems and huge issues that they've got to resolve right across the piece, including in policing. But of course, we'll be having discussions with them, not only about funding, but also about how they can support us support the police, support us in our asks around the changes to regulations around misconduct, but also support us in not only what the police are trying to deal with around crime, around enforcement being incredibly important. And today in the King's speech, we're getting new by all, if the briefing is correct, we're going to get new powers around, the police are going to get new powers around spiking. There's going to be a ban on zombie knives, finally. So it's really important that this is, yes, of course, funding will be part of those discussions, but we will have a government that will support us in the work that we're doing to really get to grips with preventing crime as well.
I hope so, and you stand ready to call them out when they don't, I presume.
We will, as I said, it's 2 weeks in. The new government has got 14 years of austerity to turn around.
If they do not support you and they do not do the same things you have asked for of the previous Conservative government, you will be calling them out in the same way.
We will always be standing up for London, funding will always be part of the discussions, not the only part of the discussions, as it was the case before.
Sounds a bit like a no to me. Why does the Met continue to rely on abstractions of officers to police, protest and wider public order events, despite the commitment in a new Met for London to stop relying on this practice, and what action is being taken to address it?
I think I've already talked about the management that's been taken to try to address abstractions and address the level of abstractions, and we are beginning to see that, and I've had discussions with the senior leadership of the Met about that, because it is so important. They are being very careful in how often they abstract individual officers, and really trying to keep an eye on that. But they're also looking at as to when they have abstracted police officers, if they are no longer needed at the protest, because the protests, basically about what is the right level of keeping police officers in central London if they have been abstracted, or can they be put back to their localities and back to their day jobs, basically. Abstractions, there will always be some abstractions, as is the case in London, but the Metropolitan Police are really trying to get to grips with this, and they had shown how they were doing this pre-October the 7th. Obviously October the 7th and the level of protests as well as the level of reassurance and the level of engagement that they had to do in local communities, and they did do a huge amount of that and continue to do that, meant that abstractions have had to be necessary.
On those abstractions, the data that we've got is fairly top level in terms of just showing defining abstraction as aid or local aid. Does MOPAC hold any further detail on what those abstractions are actually in relation to, or is there a way in which those movements could be better recorded to fully understand where those officers are going and what they're doing?
I've got those more high-level abstraction data, and it's ward level, published on the London data stores, and I presume that's what you've been looking at. And I can, in terms of what else underneath that detail, I can get back to you about what that detail is. But they certainly know, in terms of protests, I've already given the figures for shifts, how much, what level of shifts are going into the protests. What I'd have to get back to you on is how much of that is abstractions.
So in terms of looking at where aid is deployed and for what purpose, you think that's data that we could get our hands on, or that could be published?
I'll have to come back to you as to what level of detail there is held centrally at the Met, but that's fine, we can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'm grateful to you for allowing me to ask this question, which I was hoping to have put at the beginning of the session, but we were under the mistaken impression that you, Deputy Mayor, were going to make a statement. But nonetheless, I think my question is of relevance in this section, because it does raise issues about policing and how public order legislation is implemented. But before I ask my question, Chair, can I also put on record my concern, and I know that's shared by members of this, all members of this committee. I will hope so anyway, but certainly you share my concern, Chair, that the police are not here to support you, Deputy Mayor. I know this issue will be addressed in due course by the lead members of the various political groupings. Deputy, my question is this. During this election campaign, we saw an alarming trend of political intimidation of candidates and their campaigns. Examples that come to mind in my constituency are the harassment, vicious at times, of Rushna Ali, MP for Bethnal Green and Stepney, and there are other examples up and down the country as well, and not just confined to one particular party. There have been complaints also of election law breaches and inaction by police and relevant authorities. The Home Secretary is addressing these issues at a national level. But with regards to London, will you be able to inform this committee in due course what complaints the Met has received, what action is being taken, and what lessons will be learned?
Of course, I can do that, and we will do that. And as you said, the Home Secretary has announced that they are going to be looking at this in terms of looking at the Defending Democracy Task Force, and that's really important that nationally it's looked at. The level of hate and the level of intimidation and harassment some candidates received in this election in London, but also around the country. I've had reports from around and we've read, I'm sure we've all read, it's just disgraceful and unacceptable. And it is really difficult to really understand how we have got to this position where that level of hate and that level of harassment is taking place during what is a democratic process. And I really hope that we learn the lessons of what has happened, not just in terms of policing, but why that rhetoric and that level of hatred has increased and has got to boiling point in some areas during the election. I also had reports of intimidation and harassment during the course of the election, and it's really, really disturbing. It's a democratic process. I wouldn't want anybody to be put off standing for public office because of what has happened on the streets, what has happened around, their constituency offices, or what has happened really, really disturbingly. And I think it's absolutely appalling where candidates have people protesting outside their houses. Everybody has a right to private life, and of course, even politicians and candidates do. And I'm sure we all join together in really, really condemning where there has been that harassment and intimidation of candidates.
Two very quick points, Chair. The Defending Democracy Task Force was set up by the previous government. It's meeting next week to look into into these issues. And secondly, this committee, back in 2018, and I got to thank ex-Assembly Member Tony Arbour for all the work that he did. He initiated the call for this committee to look into what was going on in Tower Hamlets, and Peter Goulds was still councillor in Tower Hamlets. He gave us some very useful evidence, but we made a number of recommendations that the police said they would take on board. I think it's time for us to revisit that report. Perhaps you could again look at that report. It included recommendations such as electoral law training for police officers, but it seems that some of these things have just gone out of the window from the reports I've received about what happened in Tower Hamlets on July the 4th.
Yeah, of course we can look again, and of course also I commissioned HMIC FRS to do, to have a look at the investigation to make sure that understanding of electoral law, I hadn't, the investigation was such that it had followed all strands, and overall that's what HMIC FRS came out and said, yes, that was a solid investigation. Of course, I think there's two things going on, isn't there? Is the ability of and it is a complicated area, but the ability of officers to understand electoral law is one thing. The ability of officers and our society to protect candidates from harassment and intimidation, for me, that's not about electoral law. That's about safety. That's about democracy and about candidates being able to do what do what they should be allowed to do without fear, without harassment, and without intimidation. And I hope that's what the Defending Democracy Task Force will look at. And I'll certainly come back to you in terms of, well, what are the lessons for the Met? But I think it's also what are the lessons for us all in terms of electoral politics, how we can support people to come forward and ensure that we all lower the tone of rhetoric so that hate doesn't continue to increase and really infect the way our democracy functions.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that leads us neatly on to the next section, which is hate crime. And Assembly Member Desai, you're starting off.
Thank you, Chair. It's me again, Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, before I ask you my question, a couple of questions. I just want to clarify 2 points. There's something called the Hate Crime Stakeholder Reference Group, which was convened in July 2021. I must say, I'd never heard of this group actually, right? And it's not surprising because my information is that it met twice in 2021, once in March 2022, and again in June 2024. There's not really many meetings, is it, over the space of 3 years. And the role of this group is to provide a forum for transparency and accountability of the MAT, MOPAC, and statutory partners' response to hate crime. So on paper, a very important group, but the number of meetings or lack of meetings for 3 years is actually, I think, sort of worrying. Secondly, this is relevant to my first question, but in terms of defining positive outcomes for hate crime, my briefing tells me that positive outcomes is with reference to the number of offences resulting in a charge, summons, diversion, or out-of-court disposal. Is that right? Because what I'm really interested in is not charges, but convictions.
No, it's not the same as convictions. The conviction rate is different to the positive outcome rate. Yes.
But the briefing is correct. That is with reference to charges, summonses, diversion, or out-of-court disposal.
Yeah, there is a different rate. There is a positive outcome rate and there is a conviction rate. Those two things are different. So, right. Yeah, you are right. And then, if it then goes to court and you get a conviction, you get a different figure around the conviction rate. I mean, the conviction rate for hate crime in 2023 was 75.5% in London.
Okay, so I should also say, to be fair to you, in terms of the hate crime reference group, there are a number of meetings planned of the group between July and December 2024. But I do hope that the meetings do take place regularly, but also are action-orientated. But look, I don't want to respond to that. I'll come to my main question. So why are positive outcomes for hate crime so low, particularly for disability hate crime? And how is MOPAC working with the MAT and other key partners to increase positive outcomes?
I mean, it is low, and it's unacceptably low positive outcome rate. It's only 9.4% in 2023, and then you then have an attrition again once it gets to court, and I've already given the 75.5% rate that we've got in convictions in 2023. What we are doing is I chair the London Criminal Justice Board, and we have looked at the hate crime, at hate crime and why this rate has been so low. It is we have a particular strand of work that is looking at that, and it's the hate crime subgroup which is actually driving that improved response, which should be from investigation right through to prosecution in the courts, and we have the partners around the table for that. We, in terms of where the problems are, we have, it's similar. It's a similar tale for other areas where we have low rates of detection, low rates of positive outcome, and as well as low rates of conviction. It is around ability of the Met to and this is something that I went to visit the hate crime unit in Sutton in November of last year and discuss with them how do they make sure that they positively and quickly identify when it's a hate crime, because that's certainly something that I have had fed back to me quite a few times by victims, that they feel that the police have not spotted that it is a hate crime quickly enough, so therefore have lost the as everybody talks about, that important in really early days of investigation, and it has taken some time, which really knocks at victim confidence. So as with everything, there's victim confidence as well. But we are working on this through the London Criminal Justice Board. I would say, and I want that to increase the detection rate, the positive outcome rate and the conviction rate, but it's not the only thing that happens when victims report. They also get the referral into a consortium that we fund, and that's really important for them, that sometimes, not always, and we've got to be really clear when that is the case, but they do get support for the around being victims of hate crime as well.
Okay. Coming to my second question, what changes have been introduced by the new Connect system to the methodologies for counting hate crime and knife crime offences, and how will these changes impact the analysis of trends in these crimes over time?
So there has been a change to recording flags in Connect, and it's a technical change, which I understand, and you forgive me, that's beyond my expertise how all the technical bits work, but I understand that it means that it's going to be more accurate in the long term, but there may be an issue around the comparability between pre and post Connect because of that recording of flags. There's also been an issue about data inputting, and hate crimes not always been flagged on the front end of Connect, but that is actually that has been picked up, and that has been sorted out at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you, Chair. Before I move on to my questions around anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, I just wanted to add to Assembly Member Desai's comments around conduct around these elections in particular, but also to get your views on how or whether it's appropriate to incorporate conduct of or behaviour towards candidates and councillors and mayors, whether they are Mayor of London or mayors and leaders of boroughs. I've had cause to contact my local BCU in direct response to concerns about the safety of an individual during an election, and that was a very extreme example, but it's not an isolated example, and I just wonder whether we're going into a period where there will be local elections in London in 2026, whether it's appropriate for the Assembly, the Mayor and others to also include in that the impact of some of these behaviours on local government and good governance across our capital. So yeah, I just wanted to know what you might think at the first instance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what, in terms of the Defending Democracy Task Force, I'd hope that does look at that in terms of the impact on the conduct of people towards candidates, that it does look at that and what can be done to support them, as well as what to make sure that the policing response has always is adequate, or more than adequate, is right, is appropriate, that's the word I was looking for, to make sure the policing response is appropriate. I'm not sure exactly, of course it should be part of it, and I'd be interested in looking at what that would look like in terms of in terms of impact, what it is that we can do. Again, I mean, I've said it already. I think it's really incumbent on us all to conduct ourselves in public life in a way that is respectful, in a way that doesn't engender hate, and it doesn't increase the temperature, because we've already seen so many terrible instances in Britain of where that harassment, intimidation can escalate into violence. We've lost 2 members of Parliament. We've had multiple candidates harassed and intimidated, and I really do worry what that means for our body politic in terms of good people from their communities coming forward and to stand for office, because it can look like a difficult world out there.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So on to my...
Can I just
Yes, of course.
Thank you. On that subject then, if a picture of a candidate with racist written across their face is delivered extensively, would you call that a hate crime?
I haven't seen that. When I would have to have a look at it, and if you think it's a hate crime, you should send it to the police. I don't know.
I'm asking your opinion. Do you think that's a hate crime?
It would depend on the candidate and what they have already said, and whether it was based in evidence.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So on to my substantive questions about Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. What's been the impact of the work MOPAC and the Met are doing to tackle the increasing levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in London, and what evidence is there to support your comments?
So we do a number of things from MOPAC and with the Met in terms of trying to tackle Islamophobia as well as anti-Semitism, and obviously we all know there's been a big increase since the awful events of October the 7th. We have, and the Mayor did as well as I, quickly meet with communities and did so on a regular basis, meeting with London's Jewish as well as Muslim communities to really understand what was happening and how we can support and help. One of the first things we did was to make sure that, to ask the question, have you, especially for CST and Tel Mama, have you got, and the Catch Consortium, given the increase in incidences of hate crime that happened post October the 7th, have you got enough resources to respond? We provided an additional £250,000 to help them respond. I've been back since post mayoral election and asked the question again: are you okay? Have you got enough for what is going on? At the moment, that seems to be okay, but we are monitoring that to make sure that those organisations that people trust and people are going to have the right resources that they need in order to respond, so that victims are supported. And of course, we've got the Shared Endeavour Fund that the Mayor has, I think, a really good innovation, has been funding, and I think we're on tranche 4 or tranche 5 of the Shared Endeavour Fund, and we'll be coming out shortly to announce for the last tranche those that are going to get the funding. We're just going through the process of making sort of due diligence around that. It's made a huge difference, and we've had a number of programmes that have been supported through the Shared Endeavour Fund. It was launched in 2020, supported more than 90 projects, total investment of £3 million, over 140,000 Londoners have benefited. And it's the type of work that goes from working with communities, going into schools, really around education. I've sat in on one of the sessions in a school. I learnt about it, and it really is about myth busting, trying to develop respect between different communities and respect between different religions as well. So for example, we've funded Stand Up's Education Against Discrimination project, and that brings together Jewish and Muslim facilitators into the classroom, and sort of they look at the harmful stereotypes that are related to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So we're trying to make sure we're trying to do the prevention around the rise in hate by improving respect and understanding, and we're also making sure that we can support victims, and also as part of oversight of the Met to look at how they are, as we've discussed already, how they're actually investigating, responding to people that report hate as well.
Thank you. So you've talked a little bit and explained the initiative around focusing on young people in schools and tackling attitudes, which is really welcome. I guess I would like us to think about where incidents occur on the streets, whether it's in central London or in our communities, and the ability or the tools that officers have to identify if behaviour or speech crosses a line from normal protest into hate speech. We all have, as you know, in my constituency, following the terrorist attack on the 7th of October, there was a really acute increase in anti-Semitism, and then that was followed fairly rapidly by huge rises in Islamophobia. And I think one of the things that I have been concerned about since then, and as have actually on a cross-party basis, elected representatives in my constituency as well, been concerned about if you like, when those central London protests come home, as it were, those people come home, and then the ability of officers to identify what is and isn't acceptable, because that's having a huge impact on community policing. And just following on from the comments that Assemblymember Best made about neighbourhood policing, it has implications for that too.
I agree with you. I mean, I went to visit, a part of the Shomrin who are in your, obviously in your constituency in Hackney, and as well as Tottenham. I went to visit them after October the 7th to discuss with them, some of the incidents that actually were quite high profile at the time. There is of course, I mean, we've already touched on the importance of individual police officers being able to recognise hate crime and to be able to understand what the right response should be and investigation should be. And the Metropolitan Police have hate crime outcomes and performance officers on every BCU to look at, and they look on a daily basis at the reports of hate crime and to make sure that it has been identified right, categorised right, but also looking at the investigation and also the support that the victims need. So there is a dedicated resource that is focusing on this to try to improve what we've already talked about what is actually low positive outcome rates. They even, if the victim withdraws the allegation, there is follow-up to try to improve that liaison with the victim and try to support them through the process. Because as with domestic abuse, if the victim withdraws, often there is, the case falls. So it's really important that happens. And they've also built, the hate crime outcome performance officers have also built sort of really positive relationships with the Catch Consortium. So there is a significant focus to really try to improve that positive outcome rate and the conviction rate. And we are working with the Met and across the piece through the London Criminal Justice Board subgroup, as I've talked about already.
Okay, and thank you for that. Do you consider that those hate crime outcome officer functions are, given the structure of our BCUs, are working well? So, I have 3 BCUs, so this is not specific to one, but just as by way of illustration, the BCU which has Hackney also has Tower Hamlets, and much of the work is focused around Tower Hamlets, around Islamophobia, for example. And I'm not suggesting that is wrong. That's really good, but it does mean that that resource is quite stretched across compared to other BCUs, it's quite geographically small. But as we look at equipping the police to deal with, this becomes a neighbourhood issue. It's become a neighbourhood issue after the marches in central London and the rights and wrongs of how those have been policed. How will we kind of equip the police so that they can be part of taking the temperature down? And I also think about the relationship that the police have with local authorities and their role in dealing with, incidents or reports of hate crimes or things which might stray into hate crime but are just kind of under the threshold.
I mean, you're absolutely right. This is not just about hate crime officers, it's also about the neighbourhood response and the importance of those neighbourhood officers and DWOs being really, what we all want them to do, which is to understand their communities and to be trusted people that communities can go to when things go wrong or when that they are victims, whether it's victims of domestic abuse or hate crime. So you're absolutely right about, also putting into your comments about importance of neighbourhood officers, because it's not only about those individual hate crime performance officers, it's about the response, and to be really clear. But those neighbourhood officers are supported at a BCU level by LGBT liaison officers and faith officers, as well as those performance officers as well. In answer to your question, do I think that the balance is right and is it, how's it working? I think we need to, as part of the subgroup for the London Criminal Justice Board, that's part of the work that it needs to undertake to make sure that it is consistent, that you can see the impact of those officers and that it's ultimately we'll know if it's making a difference if we start to see that positive outcome rate increase, but also the conviction rate. And that's important across the partnership, isn't it? That we, not just positive outcomes, but we get the conviction rate increasing as well.
And finally, Chair, I just wondered how MOPAC is working to build trust within the Jewish community when reports of anti-Semitism are made, that they'll be taken seriously. There have been issues in other communities where that has been less successful, and we don't want to repeat those mistakes. So I think of an example given here to me from the Community Securities Trust, who a parent talks about their daughter not wearing their Jewish school blazer since the terrorist incidents of October the 7th, because they're really scared of what will happen to them. I have multiple cases of people who forget even going into central London, are really scared about getting onto the tube in my constituency or on the bus for fear of attacks, because they have been attacked and they don't have faith that when those crimes are reported they will be dealt with.
MOPAC has really good relationship with the Community Security Trust as well as Tel Mama, and it's part of the regular conversations that MOPAC officers have through the Catch Consortium as well, around building that trust between those organisations that communities really trust and turn to when they do become victims of hate crime or victims of crime. We do have those important relationships. I have met CST and Tel Mama on a number of occasions, as well as Muslim and Jewish leaders, to really to make sure that we have those lines of communication to improve that trust. MOPAC is also, I mean, it is slightly different, but it's part of the same sort of spectrum and continuum. It has held a number of seminars since the awful attacks in 2019, a number of seminars in collaboration with the Community Security Trust around the security of religious places of worship. There's been, number of seminars, very well attended, and the sessions cover topics including hate crime, online safety and security. So there's been a regular rhythm of those seminars. As I said, they've been well attended, and we've also amplified opportunities for London places of worship to apply for the government fund that was around physical measures of security as well. So there's, from working, interacting and engaging with communities and the organisations that are working in communities as well, like CST and Tel Mama, and then also really thinking about the places of worship. How does MOPAC interact and engage with that? We've got, I think, quite a good spectrum of activities, and we're always looking to make sure that we improve that.
Thank you. Before I come on to Assembly Member Garrett, it's good that you're having all these conversations with all these people, and we all appreciate that. The problem is, while there are big Palestinian demos going on in London, I have got Jewish friends and Jewish colleagues who will not go near London because they do not feel safe, and any amount of talking will not persuade them to go near London. Now, it's so wrong that we've got a whole group of people, a whole community, many of whom won't even come into London because they're frightened. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I've heard those things myself in the conversations that I've had with communities and leaders as well. I'm very well aware of that there are many people who do feel worried about coming into central London, and however, there is just the fundamental right to protest and to make sure that those protests, and I think the Met are doing a very good job in policing those protests to ensure that they are peaceful and they are lawful, and the vast majority have been. It is a difficult situation, and we have to balance that situation between the assurance and safety of everybody in London and the right to protest. And we are the capital city, so we do get more than our lion's share of protests, but it is a fundamental right to do that.
Yes, I can see the problem. I can also see that when they're screaming from the river to the sea, that Jewish people would feel very intimidated, and it is absolutely wrong that a whole community feels that they can't even come into our capital city because of what's going on. I'm not saying anything about the Met. I'm saying I'm standing up for the Jewish community, who should be allowed and should feel happy to come into our great city and not feel intimidated, and they absolutely do. And if I had an answer, I'd be asking you why you weren't doing it. I don't either, but it's so wrong. Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett.
Thank you, and thanks for your responses so far, Deputy Mayor. I want to ask a question about disability hate crime, because I feel that the ableism found by KC is often missed when people talk about the discrimination in the Met. When I asked a question to the Mayor recently about the approach being taken to ableism, I wasn't very assured by the plan, because the response included a slightly random list of things, which included a pilot for staff to be carrying out dyslexia tests, which I'm not sure how that connects into some of the experiences that people are having. So I just wondered if you knew of any details of that and where that had come from.
Details of the Mayor's response?
No, the dyslexia tests that staff...
I haven't got any information about the dyslexia tests.
So, just further about the plans, I want to ask specifically about the ways you are confident that the Met is ensuring that officers are trained and have an understanding of disability hate crime. This links to the experiences as well of people working in the Met who are disabled. The response previously that I had from the Mayor mentioned a culture, diversity and inclusion programme that said it would develop and implement a plan, and I just wondered how that was progressing. Thanks.
I think you're asking questions about a really important area of work that the Met needs to improve on. I think it's had a very, very good focus on sexual misconduct, misconduct towards women. It is improving its focus on race. It has to really improve its focus on disability. I mean, we all know that if you look at trust and confidence, yes, black Londoners have very, the gap between black and white Londoners is there. We all know that. But actually, if you look at those that have the least confidence, it's Londoners who are living with disabilities. And it is a real issue. And also, disability hate crime is one of the most underreported types of hate crime, strand of hate crime. There's work to be done around training, around improving the confidence of Londoners living with disabilities to come forward. And, some of the barriers around hate crime, and not just around, actually some police officers, there are barriers around an understanding around what constitutes a disability hate crime. But the Met is trying, it is putting together a plan, it is working with the Disability IAG and with its staff associations to better understand how you can overcome those barriers. And Inclusion London and partners in the Catching Consortium also advise the police on supporting their desire to improve in this area. I mean, a positive example that I've got here in my briefing is a workshop which was set up actually by the hate crime performance officers that I've talked about previously. It was set up in Brent, hosted by Brent Mind. Officers met service users, most of whom were learning disabled, and it was an opportunity for each side to, understand, see what they, to be able to really, develop that understanding and engagement, which should, I think, always, when you listen to people and listen to those who are living with disability and ask them about their experience, it always helps in terms of practice and operational policing. But I've said already, it is an area that needs to improve because we know that those living with disability have the least trust and confidence.
Thank you. It's really good to hear your strong commitment to this. Do you feel like that's reflected by the Met Commissioner, like the scale of what you've just described is felt by Mark in his approach to the trust and confidence piece? And that workshop sounds great, but it'd be great, to see the plan of that being rolled out to the rest of the officers.
Yes, it is. I mean, in terms of the new Met for London, the Commissioner is really clear that it has to be able to, the Met has to be able to serve all communities. It needs to become anti-discriminatory, and that anti-discrimination is, of course, about race and gender, but it's also about disability, and not only within, within the Metropolitan Police, but it has to improve its service to Londoners who are living with disabilities. The issue is capacity and resources and ability to move forward on all strands, and the ability to be able to really make sure that officers are properly trained and properly supported and supervised. It comes back to what the Commissioner always talks about, which is fixing the foundations, because across the piece, a lot of these issues, rather than looking at it in silos, and the College of Policing is working with the Metropolitan Police and other forces about this, is that actually there are things that if you get this right and the foundations right, you will fix all sorts of other issues. So if you get the training right, you get the supervision right, you will actually bear down on those occasions where Londoners living with disability aren't getting the service because there's been a proper response, and if there hasn't been a proper response, the supervision has picked that up.
Great, that's really good to hear. And then just a final question. I know you mentioned Inclusion London, but they talk about one of the issues that is, it's part of the underreporting of hate crime of disabled people is to do with the cuts to the funding, to the support services that would help people to independently or make that report or complaint. So I just wondered if this is something that is spoken about and how disabled people are being helped to make reports, and if there's something that maybe is being done through the Victims Commissioner or somewhere else within MOPAC. Thanks.
I'll have to look into that in terms of what you're talking about funding. I'm not aware that there's been any cuts from MOPAC funding in terms of CATCH, which would be the in terms of victim support and helping on that. But I'd have to look into that because I'm not sure what you're referring to. Yeah,
it might be the local authority funding. I'd have to bring the specifics, but it's just to do with making sure that we're looking at that bit that enables disabled people to report those crimes. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. What are the timescales for the new Transport Hate Crime Task Force, and how is it being funded? Who's represented on the task force, and what are its immediate priorities?
So this task force is under the auspices of Transport for London, so you have to forgive me, it's not one of the areas that I've got a lot of detail on, because it's the Transport for London task force that you're talking about. It is being set up. It's going to include Metropolitan Police, British Transport Police and the City of London Police, and we'll have a hate crime and violence against women and girls reference group comprising community stakeholders and the Transport for London. So that's the task force is underway. Actually, it is underway and it has been set up. Detailed questions I'd have to come back to you on, because it is under the auspices of TfL.
Okay, it's rather confusing. Wouldn't you agree that this is a hate crime task force, but it's also being shared with the TfL and the Deputy Mayor for Transport?
I'm sorry if you're confused. It's a TfL task force. Mm-hmm. It's not a MOPAC task force dealing with transport and hate crime on transport, and building on and developing the work that's already underway with it, TfL, such as the Stand Up campaign, which is on public transport around zero tolerance around hate crime. But it is led by, because it is about public transport, it's led by TfL.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell me why have the numbers of victims accessing catch services in 23-24 decreased?
So the number of victims has decreased, but I would say it's a small decrease. It's not one that I think it would particularly, obviously we'll monitor it. It's fallen by so in 23-24 there were 2,906 people supported compared to 3,082 in 22-23. So it's a 6% decrease. We obviously have to keep an eye on it, but it's not such a decrease that makes you really, really raises red flags. It's just a decrease that I have asked what's happening, but we need to make sure, as I said, it's not one that is a 6% decrease. We'll keep an eye on it. 90% of the referrals into catch actually come from the police, and it varies across the year. There's some seasonality in it. It's something we're keeping an eye on.
How is that actually funded, and how much?
We fund the catch consortium. I'm just looking how much we fund it by, and I'm not sure I've got that figure. We do fund the catch consortium through victims funding. I need to give you the detail of that. I haven't got that.
Okay. Have you any rough idea?
Oh, I'd have to come back to you.
Does it come into thousands, tens of thousands?
It'll go into maybe about 250,000.
And where do I access exactly where that money goes, and to whom?
That should be the Catch Consortium should be. There will have been a decision, and there have been decisions around the funding for it. In fact, it must be more than 250,000 because we put additional 250,000 in post October the 7th. But we can let you know that the breakdown. Of course, there should be transparency around that. Very happy to let you know the breakdown of where the funding goes and where the referrals are going to.
Okay, it must be me because I couldn't find it. So where would I
if it's not on the, we can provide that if it's not on the website.
Okay, any of these things are only transparent if you can get hold of them. I thought it was me because I'm not very good at looking these things up. Yeah, if we could have that as soon as possible, that'd be interesting, and to where the money's going and how much to each person or group or whatever. What action is MOPAC taking to help improve support to victims of hate crime?
Sorry if I left it on previously. I've talked a bit about improved investment and additional investment of the £250,000 around hate crime post October the 7th. The Catch Consortium is part of the work that we do to really understand what's happening, and as part of the London Criminal Justice Board subgroup, we look at victim support because victims is a very important strand of the work that we undertake through the London Criminal Justice Board. Yeah, certainly is. Okay, thank you. Unmesh, did you want to come in?
The new football season is about. Sorry. Deputy Mayor, the new football season is about to begin. I hope that MOPAC and the Met will recommit to addressing the scourge of hate crime out of football. And I mean by hate crime across all categories. whether it was sort of LGBT hatred, race, or misogyny, or whatever. How will you work with clubs to kick hate out of football?
I mean, in terms of there's show racism and the red card, really, and I know you've been incredibly supportive of that over the years and have done a lot of work around racism in football. Of course, there's the work that we'll do with the Deputy Mayor for Communities and the sports that she has within that around ensuring that the work that we do around hate crime goes into the new football season as well. We need to look what more we need to do around that.
Okay. Chair, I just want to say, use this meeting to plug the work being done by small clubs who often don't get the recognition. Clubs all over London, but in my part, Dagenham and Redbridge Football Club, a non-league club, Millwall Football Club, who are in the Championship, who have very sort of limited resources, but do a hell of a lot of good work. And I hope that MOPEC can actually look at how to increase this partnership working, particularly through its funding streams, to help clubs like Millwall, Dagenham, Redbridge. As I said, there are many, many clubs at a non-league level, but in the lower divisions. So attention focuses on the big clubs who do have the resources, Premiership clubs and so on. Not that I'm knocking what they're doing, but these small clubs often lose valuable advertising space. For example, in Millwall, to promote their anti-hate messages in sort of terms of big screens behind the goals, which is prime advertising site, and yet they lose. Certainly Millwall, when I went to see them 2 years ago, they're losing about £40,000 in terms of one particular screen, which they were using to plug their anti-hate messages, which they could have actually given over to a commercial enterprise. So just a small example of the work that they're doing. I will try to update my report, which I did 2 years ago, and to sort of offer some recommendations. But well done to all. Thank you.
Thank you. Turns out I should have asked Jeanette in the first place because she's so good at finding these. The answer to the question that I asked about the catch service, apparently 2 million, not $250,000.
I was very clear. I don't know the figure. I was, you asked me for an estimate, and I said it has to be more than. I did say $250,000 to begin with. Then I said it has to be more than that because we put an additional $250,000 in post October the 7th. Okay, so if anybody's watching, it's 2 million, and actually you were right, an extra $250,000. And then there seems to be an 11 million that is mixed with this catch money and shared endeavour fund. So if I could, or if we could actually have some details on those figures and where the money is going, because 2 million is quite substantial. I know it's a small drop in the amount of people that are helped, but we must always look after victims. We spend a lot of time looking after perpetrators. We must look after victims. But it would be interesting for us all, I'm sure, to find out where that money is going and who's being paid to look after victims. Thank you for that. So we're now going on to violent crime. And the first questioner is Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. What concerns, Deputy Mayor, do you have about the levels of violence against person offences in London, and how is MOPAC working with the Met to tackle this?
We're working really hard with the Met and with partners around violence in terms of what is happening in London. I mean, just to put it into context, and we are, the Mayor has been very clear that his absolute top priority is tackling violence, and it's violence in all its forms, including violence against women and girls. And it's really important for me that we're always really clear that this includes violence against women and girls. I chair a homicide reduction partnership, which brings, in fact I chaired it yesterday, which brings together partners with the Metropolitan Police to really understand, how they can work together. It includes the boroughs and the Youth Justice Board and Directors of Children's Services as well. Really important that partnership, that the enforcement work that the Met can do in reducing violent crime is backed up with a cross-system response around dealing with the perpetrators, but also the prevention of violence. So, we have, and the context that I think we need to put it into is that whilst we will always focus on tackling violent crime, and any homicide is one too many, we are still seeing a reduction in homicide since 2016, which is an important matter for us. But we need to go further, and you are less likely to be a victim of violent crime in London than you are in other parts of the country. It's important context, but it doesn't mean that we are complacent in any way. We are still really focusing on tackling violence. That means making sure that the work of the Violence Reduction Unit continues in prevention and working with young people to divert them, provide their ability to, abilities to stay in school. There's the Inclusion Charter, which are now 24 boroughs, I understand, have now signed up for the Inclusion Charter. I think it's a really substantial and exciting step forward in working with schools to to keep young people and children in schools, because we all know what happens if they do get excluded, and that they the difficulties that they can get into after that. So, as I said, we are working really hard in terms of with the Violence Reduction Unit, with the Metropolitan Police on their summer crime fighting plans, for example, which really have been very, very specific in looking at where are the areas of greatest violence, where are the areas of greatest crime, what is the operational response, and then what is the response of partners to support them in that.
Thank you, and that's very encouraging. Deputy Mayor, do you believe the decision to disband the Met's Violent Crime Task Force and the move to local proactive teams was the right one? And if so, why? And what has been the impact of this?
So that happened, that was properly implemented in January, so it is early days to understand what the impact of that has been. It was, of course, a direct response to Baroness Casey's report in terms of what has happened in the Metropolitan Police, which was that too much was being held centrally, that the boroughs and the BCUs and the commanders of the BCUs did not have enough flexibility over their staff, their officers and their resources, and it was in response to that, and I think it was right that there is that response to bolstering the front line, giving those borough commanders the ability to, with some specialist officers, to be able to develop their response to what is happening locally. One of the things that we are doing in MOPAC, of course, is we are working with the Met to make sure that they understand the impact that has had, that there hasn't been, and they can see from the central tasking to the local tasking that they can see that violence is still a priority. It's something we've asked for in terms of the statistics and the impact. I've been and spoken to Hackney and Tower Hamlets Borough commander and his team around what does that look like, and I've been, had some I went last week to talk to them about this, about what that meant and the capacity that they had, which meant that they could flex the resources, they could really, respond to local hotspots around violence and work really proactively rather than having to go back to the centre, make the arguments. He had it there, and it was, obviously it's anecdotal. We need to make sure that this is consistent and across London, but actually it felt like a real step forward for borough commanders to be able to respond locally to local issues. And we all know there's been quite an issue in Hackney and Tower Hamlet. Well, Hackney post the terrible shooting of the 9-year-old girl, and I was told that you could see how they'd managed to brigade the resources they had and be able to respond really quickly.
Thank you. You said that obviously it's only been a few months, and the anecdotal evidence that you've provided does sound very encouraging. At what point will there be an assessment of the impact of this initiative?
It's been assessed at the moment, and we are waiting for the results, and that's something we have asked for because we're obviously very keen to make sure that what I think is a good decision in terms of responding to Baroness Casey means that the boroughs have the ability to absolutely prioritise violence and prioritise it in responding locally. That's something, as MOPAC oversight, we've had those discussions with Alexis Boom, who leads on performance and tasking for the Metropolitan Police, and we are expecting that assessment to come through.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my question, I just want to answer a question that the Deputy Mayor seemed unable to answer. A leaflet that has the words racist plastered across a candidate's face is a hate crime. It puts that community at risk because they believe everybody's racist when they see what they would see as an official document, and also it puts that individual at risk because people who are perceived as racist are often attacked. In this case, it happened to be a woman. So there's a leaflet put out that put a woman at extreme risk. So I would say yes, that is a hate crime, and it's a bit disappointing that the Deputy Mayor was unable to identify this, because there'll be whole communities reading that leaflet who feel under pressure because they think everybody's racist because they're reading it from official documents. Just to be clear, I feel very, very strongly about that. Right, we are talking about violent crime here, Deputy Mayor.
Point of order, Chair. If the member feels strongly about it, has it been reported to the authorities for further investigation?
I believe so.
Right, okay, I just want to clarify that. I just think it's very important that we don't blur the edges around, if there is an investigation, about trying to bounce issues one way or another. But I do take the point and the seriousness that the members are raising the issue. But I just want to be clarity, so we're all clear about what's going on around this table, rather than the few.
Well, thank you. Again, I feel very strongly about that. What has contributed to the decrease in lethal barrel discharges in London, and what lessons could be learned to tackle other weapon offences such as knife violence?
There has been a decrease in lethal barrel discharges since 2016, and that is welcome. I think it's terms of the Met's ability to really have a good grip on serious and organised crime, because actually when you're talking about lethal barrel discharges, we're talking about gangs and organised crime, aren't we? We're not talking about mostly talking about street gangs. It's a serious and organised crime issue mostly. The Metropolitan Police has generally had good inspection reports around their ability to bear down on serious and organised crime, and they have been doing that and continue to do that.
Do you accept that whilst discharges from barrels have gone down, gun crime has increased by 20%?
No, I think both gun crime and lethal barrel discharges have decreased since 2016. So you might be looking at a different time frame, but the statistics that I have are since 2016, in the 12-month period to May 2016 compared to the 12-month period to June 24, gun crime is down 9.5% and lethal barrel discharge is down 42%. You might have different time frames, but that's the time
I may
frame
well
we've
have
got.
a different time frame, and what's alerting me to this, because this is a very, very technical term, let's go over this term again, lethal barrel discharges. That sounds to me like we're focusing on a very particular part of gun crime and not the overall thing, who's actually getting hurt, who's been terrorised with these weapons. Why has this very, very niche stat come to the fore? Am I correct that gun crime has gone up, and is that why this has happened?
So I can repeat again, gun crime since 2016 has continued to fall. It's 9.5% down. Lethal barrel discharge is 42% down. In terms of why they are both down, again, I think it is because the Metropolitan Police has a good record of dealing with serious and organised crime. It has a good grip of it, and it continues to proactively work on serious organised crime, because often, well, nearly always, as I'm sure you are aware, as I've said, when it comes to the use of guns and the lethal barrel discharges, we're into the territory of serious and organised crime and OCGs and that territory, as we have seen, as we think we have seen in Hackney with the recent shooting of the 9-year-old. So it is their ability to bear down on that has been really important, and it means that we've got those figures.
We can both agree that this is the very most organised and most serious level of crime, and particularly gun crime. But I'm intrigued why this figure has come forward. We have a dispute between our figures, fair enough. But when we're concentrating on lethal, does this mean we're not talking about people who were just harmed by a weapon? We're not talking about the terror that's generated by having a weapon? We're not talking about weapons that were used in a robbery, whatever, because this is a very specific thing. And I worry that if we start measuring this in any extreme fashion, we will lose the other aspects of this gun crime, which are equally important to the community.
So I don't necessarily, for you have focused on these two statistics.
Well, the police have, because this is new.
And the police, it's important, they are important statistics that you can see that decreasing. Fatal shootings in London have fallen over the last 3 years, from 15 homicides to 9. Obviously, that's awful that we've had 9 homicides in 2023. You know, I do always feel sensitive about quoting statistics when you're talking about people's lives, but you know we are on the statistics strand at the moment. So in terms of the ability of the Met to bear down on fatal shootings, the ability to look at gun crime, the Met have had specific operations in specific areas to really look at that, and they are, you know, the Met have a good track record on serious and organised crime, and that will be what is mostly behind this.
Could you tell me, the Deputy Mayor, how many non-lethal shootings we've had, maybe?
No,
I would have to get back to you, and I'd have to ask the Met
can I do a point of information? I thought it was to do with the barrel being lethal, not the injury. So it's to do with a lethal barrel being discharged rather than a lethal injury.
No. If something, I read it as something that came out of that barrel was lethal, not somebody who smacked you in the head with the barrel.
I think in terms of these technicalities, it would be really helpful. I'm really happy to get together the information about the technicalities around the because in terms of the recording of crime, there's lots of different technicalities behind how the police record things and what they need to record in which area. Really happy, and I'm sure the Met would be really happy to brief you on exactly what crime or what incident involving a gun or a lethal barrel or a fatal shooting or a non-fatal shooting, to brief you on that. It really is, and I know we've not got the Metropolitan Police here, but that is for them to brief you.
Therein lies the problem. But there has been a 20% increase in gun crime since last year, and I just feel like this kind of over-focusing is trying to cover that up. That's why I bring it to you in that way. Do you welcome the violence harm assessment, and what indicators are being used to measure its impact?
I think the violence harm assessment or index, it varies sometimes as to whether it's the VHA or the VHI. It is a progress, and it's a step forward from the gangs violence matrix, because it is more objective rather than subjective as to who goes on it, and the Cambridge Harm Index lies behind it, and there is a much more scientific approach to risk assessment. It means that individual officers, which used to be the case of the gangs matrix, the individual officers' subjective, I know it's professional, but subjective view of individuals could change, could put somebody onto the matrix and change where they were in the matrix. My understanding and the assurances I've had is that is no longer the case. But we're not going to just sit and list, just say, okay, you've given us the insurance. The Gangs Violence Matrix Review was very clear about the lessons that needed to be learnt, and we are also really clear from MOPAT that those lessons aren't just because, one, only for the Gangs Violence Matrix, there has to be read across to the violence harm assessment, and we will be reviewing it as well to make sure that read across has happened, and that the violence harm assessment hasn't fallen into some of the pitfalls that the gang violence matrix fell into.
Could you give us a flavour of the measures that are going to be used to measure its impact? Because I accept it is an innovation on the gangs matrix, which was, like you say, highly subjective. But how are we going to make sure that this is an improvement? What are we asking for here?
So one of the things that we will make sure is that review that we will undertake from the Evidence and Insight team in MOPAC to look at how the violence harm index has worked, what has happened to some individuals, but of course the real impact, the assessment of the impact will be what has happened to those individuals. Has violence reduced, and has that risk, the risk that those individuals who are on the index or the assessment or the list, has that risk reduced? And we are going to be looking at that through the Evidence and Insight team and the review that we will undertake. We had an annual review. We had a commitment to an annual review for the Gangs Violence Matrix. We are also committed to making sure that we review this as well.
Just two quick short questions on this before I move on. As someone who worked with lots of young people who are on the gang matrix, do the individuals know they're on it now, and what can they do to get off?
They don't. We still have that same issue, which for communities, and I had that said to me a lot of challenge around that. But if you're on the violence harm assessment, it's not something that will be made known to the individual.
So my second question becomes a moot point. Okay, I think that's something you may need to continue to look at, because it doesn't give young people the chance to improve away from said matrix. What plans are there in place to increase investment in youth clubs and positive opportunities to protect young Londoners from gang crime in particular?
So there's a number of ways in which we try to protect and support young people not to get involved in gang crime. Violence Reduction Unit's work is obviously really key here. Is really key here in terms of the work that the investment and the work that they do with with young people. Mayor's invested over £100 million in London's youth sector. It's provided over 500,000 positive opportunities for young Londoners since 2016. But also part of the work that the Violence Reduction Unit does is not just about working, the investing in projects that work with individuals and young people. It is also about investing in supporting the workforce that works with those young people. Really important priority around working with youth workers.
Sorry to interrupt you. As a former youth worker, I want to ask a question. So does the mayor's money, for instance, support salary? That will be the question that most small charities around London would ask themselves. Would they be able to support the salaries of some of their workers?
So the investment will be able to pay for some of the workers, of course, that will happen. But it's not just about that, it's also about supporting them in terms of their professional development. Over 400 youth workers have been trained through the Rise Up programme that the Mayor has invested in via the Violence Reduction Unit. Really important, because it's about the training, but it's also about I think it's also about the recognition of the important work that youth workers undertake in our communities, and the really important relationships that they develop with young people. Really, they can be the make or break for young people, can't they, youth workers? And that the Violence Reduction Unit has absolutely prioritised that and it's also invested in youth workers in obviously in hospitals with the Accident Emergency Unit, and invested in youth workers in custody suites to pick up young people from 10 to 25 who are going through custody suites, to give them support, diversionary activities, and to try to make sure that time that they are in custody is the last time that they're in custody.
This is my final question. How are you specifically measuring that this work is reducing crime? Because you don't have to convince me that youth work is a powerful thing for young people, but how is it specifically reducing crime? Because that would be the KPI that an outsider might ask for.
So the Violence Reduction Unit has developed a quarterly performance report, and it's developed that in looking at what has been the impact of its projects and programmes and the investment that it has had. It has shown it in terms of hospital-related work. It has shown that those young people that are going through it and have been part of the. I'm just trying to find the figures, but it's been successful in diverting young people away from activity and reducing their risk. In terms of that direct link, and this is always an issue, isn't it? Because it is a lot of the work of the Violence Reduction Unit is about early intervention and prevention, the school inclusion charter, and how do you make that link between that young person that has remained in school, so therefore has not become has not gone down the route of criminal activity. It is a difficult direct link to be made. However, the Violence Reduction Unit does have the evaluation of its projects and programmes, evaluating particularly on the impact of its young people, and you can see in some of those evaluations that it has had a significant impact on the life chances and the way, the lives of those young people it's working with.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. And just in case anybody's wondering, the knife crime overall up by 20% comes from the Office of National Statistics, just so that if you want to look that up, it says it's gone up by 20%. Assembly Member Deval wanted to come in on one of those points.
Yeah, can you just clarify? Because I thought I had information that the gangs matrix had been stopped from February this year and no longer exist. Do you still think it's working, or do you look? I recognise the problems that we had with it in the past. I thought that had been cleaned up, and the information contained on that matrix was much more appropriate in terms of tackling and preventing further crimes. I understood it had been disbanded now in February, but from the way that you answer questions, it sounds like it's continuing. Can we just get clarification of that? I've got one further question, Chair.
No, sorry, apologies, that wasn't clear. That the violence harm assessment it's been moved. You know, the gangs violence matrix is no longer used. They have developed the violence harm assessment as an ability to they obviously need to know who their high risk Londoners are and have an understanding about how they focus. That's what the violence harm assessment is.
I tell you what, is it enhanced? It doesn't take away your contribution this morning, but not having someone from the Metropolitan Police Service to present the detail clearly and just not undermines our work here, but also I think the failure of the Metropolitan Police to explain their mission on policing is not good, to be honest, and they lose out on this, because if it is about building trust, they've had an opportunity to not use it sitting beside you, but it doesn't take away your contribution this morning, which I'm very grateful for in the way that you've answered questions. I go back to this question then. The new harm index is really about individuals. Tackling gangs that still exist in London is not a specialised crime issue, is still a crime that needs to be tackled in a certain way. How does that correlate in terms of individual indexes around that harm when they're doing it as a group activity, or their group of crimes is having an impact on that in terms of that? What is the future? I know this maybe will be an operation, but from your perspective, because it's an important issue for London, what is your perspective about future intelligence, proactive disruption of gang activity? If we move to that individual index, will it be picked up, do we think? Is that part of your assessment of what would be, lost? I don't want to go back to the bad old days, because that gang matrix index was pretty poor originally, and you did take steps, and the intervention was welcomed by MOPAC in putting it back into the right perspective. So what, are there going to be gaps in the future? That's my concern, and maybe it's something I should address to the police, and I'd love to, but they're not here, so you've got it.
I think the Met would be far better explaining that than I would, but to give you some assurance, that was my question to the Met, in terms of, yes, you need to do something about the gangs violence matrix, and I understood the rationale and the logic of focusing on individuals, but my question was, okay then, how are you then also going to bear down on gangs? Because we know, although it has been decreasing in the number of homicides that are attributed to gangs and gangs violent, that has, it is not as high as it used to be. It is still an issue in London. We all know it's still an issue in London. The Met still have a strategy around gangs. They still do, proactive operations around gangs. But I could see the logic for the individuals, that you focus on the individuals, as well as the work that they're doing through serious and organised crime on their gang enforcement.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think the Met would be far better explaining that than I.
Okay, I would just like to say that everything Len has said is agreed across all the parties. We are trying to gear the questions so that you can answer, and thank you for answering them. But obviously there are questions we would also like to be putting to police officers, because there are many, many problems with the Metropolitan Police at the moment, and it's actually our job to be asking questions. I know technically it should be our job to be asking MOPAC, but there are some questions we want answers to that we can't ask you. So just to say, we're all on as one on this. We should be having police officers here. Assembly Member Desai, is it to do with the last question?
Sort of carry on, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about the violent crime task force, and again, I think this is a question that could have been better answered by the Met being here, but nonetheless, I still got to put this question to you, Deputy Mayor. So some of us, about 3 years ago, I think before COVID, we had the chance to go with the task force when they were patrolling in South London, and some impressive work was being done there. And what impressed me was that they had an overview of the whole of London. It's not rocket science, but the gangs don't recognize BCU boundaries. They work across London and outside London, home counties and elsewhere. And as I said, this is an operational matter, but I'm just worried that that sort of expertise that was built up, I mean, you might call it elitist unit, but for me, what counts as action and what works? And presumably the Met, is taking into account how to have an overall sort of London-wide framework. It's all very well, and I suppose the concept of working at local levels, but it's that sort of the relationship between the different parts of London, keeping tracks and of the various gangs, and how to sort of have a London-wide approach?
So the vast majority of the task force has gone locally to BCUs, but there has been a part kept centrally to be able to do that analysis that you're talking about and to keep a view pan-London of the trends, the hotspots, the areas that, and those sort of things that you've talked about. That has been kept at the centre. But what has happened is that the actual officers who are doing the proactive work, the stops and searches, and probably the things that I went out with them as well, that you saw them doing, that is what has gone to the BCU level, and it's at that BCU level that I think it is, the additionality will be proven, but there is still, they have kept a bit centrally to make sure that they've got that central analysis, which is what I found very, I remember going into the Lambeth, the SOR, I can't remember what it stands for, and you could see on the boards, everybody knew what was going on in London. That's, that central capacity is still there.
You answered my question. Thank you.
I'm really glad to hear that's still there. I thought they were an incredible group of officers, and the amount of work they did was stunning. I only hope that it's not watered down by going to the BCUs.
Yeah, and they were and they are, and that expertise and experience is now being sort of made. It has been properly integrated into local policing, and actually also after a bit, that was one of the things that I heard when you went into neighbourhoods and talked to police officers and borough commanders, that there was that gap between, and that's what, Baroness Casey also picked up. There was a gap between the central work, central resources, as the Met would call it, those central task force and the locally, and it was a problem that there was that gap. So often a BCU commander might not know that they were on his patch, or his or her patch. Now he's got he or she has got that experience, he's got those officers, and he's able to respond to local issues, and I think that's quite powerful because it's dealt with. You've still got that central overview of what is happening, but you've also got the ability locally at a BCU level to really flex.
Yeah, I agree with you. If there were actually officers there to integrate into, and that is one of the main problems, there aren't enough officers, especially experienced ones, and we all agree on that.
Well, there is obviously, and we've talked about a lot, an issue about experience. The Met is under burden, pressure. There are, however, about 33,800 police officers in the Met who are working and out there keeping our communities safe.
I know equally when we asked the Commissioner last at one point, nobody was sure just how many officers were on each BCU. So I'll leave it at that, but you can argue the point. And yes, one would say, where are all those officers? But we are being told that they're not there for duty in the front line when they're needed. The last two questions on this violent crime section are from Emma Best, Assembly Member Best.
Thanks, Sophie. As part of the new Met for London, there was a commitment to produce a new children and young people strategy by November 2023. The last date that we've been promised that is summer 24 now. Do you have a more precise date?
It's scheduled for September 2024, and you're right, it was, well, you're obviously right in terms of it was going to be published in November 2023. The Met have, I think, rightly taken their time to consult and engage across the partnership to make sure that they get this right. It's a really important piece of work. It isn't, and there is expertise and experience that the Met has. What's the right word? Has pulled upon, as gained by consulting and engaging and making sure that they get this right.
Do you see though that it plays into this issue with trust at the moment, and to say there'll be a strategy for children and young people in in November 2023, and then to have almost a year delay on that? I appreciate the point around wanting to consult, but that's something that you would know in the outset of wanting to put this strategy together. And do you see how that is again damaging to the trust, especially around young people, to say we're going to deliver a strategy for you, and then a year later it arrives, hopefully a year later.
So in my years of working with the Met, one of the things that I've really noticed is that they have, we've talked about it in procurement, we talk about it across the piece, they have real optimism bias, that we call it. They set down deadlines that they are just too optimistic, and I think this one was one of them, that they really wanted to be able to do this, but in terms of actually the work that was needed, they miscalculated that. And yes, I can see how making commitments that you don't, of course, making commitments that you cannot, you can't meet does have an impact. However, I think it would have more of an impact to produce a children's strategy that is, that actually people are very interested in it, that if they then produced it and it was not of the right calibre, they hadn't consulted the right people, that would also have, I think, more of an impact on trust and confidence.
I agree, but I think it's just another self-inflicted wound, isn't it? That I just think is very unnecessary. I think suggesting that we will wait until summer 24, September 24 for the strategy is reasonable, but it was unnecessary to promise it then. And forgive me, because obviously I'm slightly new to the committee and I know that it's been talked about here, but could you, for my benefit, tell me more about the strategy, the age ranges of the strategy, the different types of violence? Is it going to be, for example, looking at sexual and domestic violence? And is it looking at children in both the instance of perpetrator and victim?
So yes, it is looking at, that's one of the feedback that that the Met has been given from us and right across City Hall, not just MOPAC, because obviously there's quite a lot of work with children and young people across the piece, and it absolutely has to look at children as victims and perpetrators, and really important that we don't lose sight of that, and that children can be perpetrators. We know that actually we've had some really horrific instances of young people committing homicide. We know that young people carrying knives, we all know that, so it is really important that children's strategy enables frontline officers to be able to respond in the right way when they have a child in front of them, but to make sure that they can also respond because actually they have a perpetrator in front of them as well. The age range, I'm pretty sure, is 0 to 18 in terms of the age range. So did you ask me something? What was the other thing you asked me about it?
Sorry, I asked you what the age range was. From what age does it begin?
It will be up to 18.
From birth?
Well, no, it won't be from birth because its criminal responsibility is 10, isn't it?
Well, this is what I'm asking about. This is my question. Are we looking at children as victims, for example?
So,
is it solely?
So on the perpetrator, it is up to 18 in terms of the age of the child. What the strategy is about is really trying to ensure that all officers and staff within the Metropolitan Police understand what it means when they are working with either a victim that is a child or a perpetrator that is a child, and that they respond appropriately to that. It is a strategy that, for example, has been put in place in the youth justice system, to make sure that happens. So that's what it's about. We are working with the Met to make sure that our feedback around partnerships, around protected characteristics, but also around actually really importantly proposed metrics about impact is taken on board by the Met, and we're having those discussions at the moment.
Sorry, so just tell me again, because I just want to understand. So will it talk about children as victims, say if they're a 5-year-old, or is it more about dealing with adolescents?
It's looking at children and young adults as both victims and perpetrators. So if you've got victims that are of any age, it will be looking at that. But obviously as the perpetrators, it's looking at, it'll be looking at the ages of criminal responsibility, what that means for police officers in terms of in the way in which they respond.
Okay, because you just said it wouldn't go down to birth, which was what confused me.
I was thinking about perpetrators when you asked me that question.
Hopefully we don't have to worry about that yet for babies. Just moving on slightly, in March 2024, the committee produced a report preventing violence and protecting young people. Is that a report that you've had a chance to look at?
I have looked at it, but I haven't got anything in front of me about it, so if you're going to ask me a question about it, you'll have to bear with me.
The committee asked for a response back to that by the 31st of August. Do you think that is something that will happen?
It should happen. It will be in the system if it's the 31st of August, and we will make sure, do our best to make sure that that happens.
Okay, I won't ask you any questions about it, given you don't have the notes there. Finally, I wanted to ask on the new violence and exploitation support service. How will it differ and complement existing services protecting young people from violence?
So we used to fund the London Gang Exit and Rescue and Response and Empower. All three of those services were, really good services. Rescue and Response in itself was very innovative, but as it developed and as it, those three services worked side by side, it became obvious or apparent that there was some crossover, that actually, a service, there was some crossover and a little bit of duplication. So when those contracts were ready to be reprocured, we worked with the Violence Reduction Unit and with partners to really look at how do you deal with the individual child, rather than having different services that they might have to go between, or different services slightly overlapping and slightly duplicating the work. How do you bring that all together? And that's what the new Violence and Exploitation Support Service is about. It was launched on the 3rd of June, and it is what's the right word? It is mobilising at the moment, but there has been a very clear piece of work to make sure that those young people who are within the services already don't suddenly get a cliff edge, that those cases are properly managed and that they are managed over into the new service.
I'm sorry, do you have a date for that?
It was launched on the 3rd of June.
So you said that you didn't want anyone to go over the cliff edge, but surely we know now then that people haven't been lost out, and that we know that there's been successful transfer of all cases.
I haven't had any information, or it's not been. Normally, those things would be reported to me by exception, so I presume it is, and it will be a piece of work that MOPAC officers are undertaking and overseeing. It's mid-July, so it would be something that I would have reporting on, probably on a quarterly basis.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that finishes our violent crime stage. Now we're going into neighbourhood policing. So Assembly Member Lord Bailey to start, please.
How are the Met and MOPAC working together to improve relationships between BCU commanders and local borough leaders?
The Commissioner set out very clearly in New Met for London around his ambitions around neighbourhood policing, which is incredibly important in terms of that improving local trust and confidence from communities in the police. We have worked with the Metropolitan Police around in terms of the engagement, and we've done a big piece of work reviewing that engagement at a local level, and that includes, there's the community engagement, but also includes the community scrutiny and the importance of that, because around trust and confidence, the accountability and transparency is very, very important as well. The Mayor has obviously, as part of working with the Metropolitan Police, has been investing in the Met, and that means that they have the additional police officers to be able to transfer into neighbourhoods, and including dedicated ward officers as well. That neighbourhood model is something that we have oversight of, and it's something that the Met have developed. So there's a number of ways that we work with the Met on this. One around community engagement and scrutiny, two around the oversight around neighbourhood policing, and three around the investment into the Met, which means there are additional officers there.
My specific question is around borough leaders, though, because obviously when we went to BCUs, we lost the sort of borough commander model. So when you talk about borough, what's happening to rebuild that relationship? And do you accept that the decision to replace 32 borough operational commanders with 12 BCU units in 2018 was a mistake? And has neighbourhood policing recovered from that?
So apologies about the borough leader part of that question.
Yeah.
One of the first things that the Commissioner did when he came in was to appoint the borough superintendent. So each borough now has a superintendent whose role is around that liaison with the local borough, around the leaders and also the chief exec and the officers. And that, to all intents and purposes, I hope you've had the same feedback. When I go out and talk to boroughs, they are very complimentary and positive about the role that superintendent is now playing and how important that is. The Casey review is really clear about the BCU restructure that happened, that it was driven by austerity. It was driven by the need at that time for the Met to save considerable amount of money, but also at that time the Met was moving towards, well, it did get below 30,000 officers, so it had to restructure in order to be able to, ensure that it could respond in the right way to what was happening in London. Now, Casey was really clear that some of the decisions that took place, despite the fact that it was austerity driven, weren't decisions that have landed, and the impact has not been what was expected. That's part of the response of that is the Commissioner putting in the borough superintendents. Part of the response to that is the Commissioner, as part of New Met for London, increasing the number of officers that are going to go into the public protection units and making sure that there is specialism and expertise in those public protection units. But he is not looking at restructuring. The structure itself is staying, but he's very much looked at what was the impact, were there some gaps or vulnerabilities that have transpired since it was in place, and he has taken those decisions which are important decisions.
So it was or it wasn't a mistake?
It wasn't. Well, it had some vulnerabilities. The restructure has clearly thrown up some vulnerabilities around neighbourhood policing and that link between the boroughs, and the Commissioner has responded to that. It was a necessity at that time to do that restructure because of austerity. The Met was moving towards 30,000. Well, got to below 30,000. It had huge amounts of money that had to take out of the system. It was a decision that was necessary, and now where there has been some vulnerabilities, that I think rightly the Commissioner has taken steps to put that right.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Did you want to come in, Assembly Member Deval?
Just two issues on the new conversations for best practice and bringing partners together. Where is some of the London-wide forums where local government and the Metropolitan Police come together? We know at local level, in some parts it still exists, but I'm not clear if that pattern is consistent across London, or if so, the impact of that work is variable, right, in terms of some of that partnership work. Where is it London-wide strategic direction now taking place? Just remind us where that is.
So in terms of London-wide on partnership, we have a few boards where we have that partnership looking at it London-wide strategically. London Criminal Justice Board being one, which has boroughs on it, a borough representative on it, and also has the Met, and I chair it. We have the Violence Against Women and Girls Board, where we have borough. All the boards have that partnership to look strategically across the piece. There is also has been, and I think this is really welcome, there has been I would have to ask boroughs whether they feel it's a step change, but there has been a real shift in the engagement London-wide between the Metropolitan Police and boroughs. The what's it called? The Council of Leaders. They now invite the Commissioner, and I will also be going with him to have that discussion strategically London-wide as to what is happening, which is really important. It fell by the wayside a bit in the previous administration, and but that has been reinvigorated. And strategically, the Met are engaging in more of the pan-London structures. We engage ourselves in London councils, MOPAC does, as well as chief executives by going to the chief executive, CELC, chief executive local London councils. I can't remember the exact phrase of the words exactly, but we engage at Pan London on that as well.
Well, of course, we can't change everything overnight in terms of new regimes, but we have a further opportunity where we can be less fragmented in terms of some of those discussions, and particularly where local government working in partnership with the police can produce better outcomes. Because I do think from their respective responsibilities, the police are the lead agency in tackling crime, but they can't do it alone. And one partnership that needs nurturing, given where local government has faced many cuts over the years, this is the one that needs a bit more strategic coordination. I think it may well be lost, and maybe, Chair, we might return to it in the future. Can I just ask, in terms of various reforms, you earlier indicated when we talked about the work at violence suppression units about the importance of pushing resources down locally, that locally people taking decisions that impacted on their communities and giving us better outcomes. Do you not think that one of the reforms around the BCU was looking at wider flexibility about managers within those BCUs? We've seen the new additional of the superintendents, which I think would be welcomed about that focus. But do you think there is a further reform that we could look at where there are appropriate checks and balances of where there is still about BCUs working under less flexibility about some of the issues they should have control over in terms of producing better outcomes locally?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because I think the Commissioner and the senior leadership team have taken some quite important decisions around making sure that those central resources and central teams are much at BCU level now. I think you've got to let that bed in, and then the Commissioner needs to look at is there anywhere else that you might be able to push, really change that balance between the front line and central specialist units. But I do think he's taken some really difficult decisions around that, and brave decisions around that, and not just about the units, but he's also taking the decisions to move people into the frontline policing directorate, and that is those are difficult decisions. So it's not just about actual teams, it's also about individuals, because when you look, and I'm sure he's talked about this here, when you look at the supervision, for example, the supervision ratios in the specialist units, they're much more what you would want them to be than they are in the front line. So he is moving people into the front line. So I think it's one of those things that is an evolving picture. I think the Commissioner needs to take a view as to when that bed's down, is there anything else?
Thank you.
Can I say, I think putting superintendents back in the boroughs is a very, very good move, and hopefully it will edge towards going back to borough-based policing, which is something, as you know, I'm very in favour of. Could you update the committee on progress on the commitment and it's in a new Met for London, to have at least 2 dedicated ward officers, 1 PCSO in every ward?
So that's an existing commitment, wasn't it, around the 2 DWOs and 1 PCSO in every ward. At the moment, the figures that I have are that 80% of wards have 2 dedicated ward officers and at least 1 PCSO, and that was 80% in June 2024. 91% of wards have at least 2 DWOs, 95% of wards have at least 1 PCSO. So those are the figures.
Okay, do you have figures on just how many of those have to take buses to their wards that they're policing? Because I do stop and talk to frontline officers, and the number that tell me that the problem is they are stationed miles away from the ward that they're supposed to be serving. So they lose half their shift trying to travel from their base to where they're supposed to be working.
I'm afraid I don't have that figure. It is something we do have the figures for, but I don't have it in front of me, so I'd have to get back to you.
If you could send them.
Yeah, of course. It's a 20-minute travel time, isn't it? That it should be that they should be able to get to their ward within 20-minute travel time. The Commissioner's been really clear as part of New Met for London. He thinks that's too long, and he wants to change that. As part of the work, he is looking as to how he can base more of those dedicated wards officers either in their wards or closer to their wards.
Yeah, because in outer London, of course, they haven't got a bus every 5 minutes like you have in inner London. So there's a big difference there. And if you miss a bus, then literally half their shift can be messed around just waiting to try and get to their ward. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Just on this business of officer numbers and the whole new Met for London plan, and the recognition that we're going to have to significantly increase the intake of new police officers. The Met themselves have stated that the reform of the Met will be more limited and slower than it should be because of the huge budget shortfall and officer shortages. Now, I know that you've said already that we're just 2 weeks in to a new government, but the new government came as no surprise to anybody. And it would have been the responsibility of the Deputy Mayor for Policing and indeed the Mayor themselves to be liaising with both main parties. I appreciate the Lib Dems weren't likely to form a government themselves, but certainly with both main parties to make the case for new investment in the Met. So what conversations have you had, or what conversations have you planned with the new policing ministers in order to ensure that we are going to get the necessary investment in London to deliver the new Met, which we all need?
We have been around this quite a bit already today, but as I've said already, we will be having those discussions with the new government around how they can support London. And we will be making sure that we make the case, and funding will be part of those discussions. And of course, we are only 2 weeks in. It's the King's speech must be happening now. He's probably on his feet. I don't know what time it is. So we will, new ministers have been incredibly busy, but we have already asked for meetings. We will be having those meetings, and funding will be part of those discussions.
But surely conversation should have happened already. As I say, it wasn't a surprise that we have a new government. So the idea that this is 2 weeks in is surely quite specious.
Well, it is 2 weeks. Yeah, it's 13 days in. We are, where, that's literally where we are.
Okay, so you waited until May the 5th to find out whether you were going to do your job.
We've been very clear all along what the funding position is of the Met, and of course we've had discussions with our colleagues in the front bench. We are now going to be having discussions with them now they are actually ministers and Home Secretary, which is, given the 14 years of austerity, they've come into government, they need to look at what is possible, the art of the possible, what is actually happening, really understand it, and we'll be having those discussions.
Okay, but we've had 8 years of the same mayor, and now we're into the third term. So you would have known what was needed and been
you're
having the
asking me the same question.
Earlier.
I've given you my answer. Well, I've given you my answer. Of course, we've had discussions. We are going to have more discussions. We're very clear about what we would like in terms of support from the government. And apologies, Susan, it is going to be different because we will have a government that is more supportive and not whipping up hate. I don't agree with you on that, Susan. And funding will be part of it.
Okay, point of factual correction, July the 5th, not May the 5th.
Okay, Assembly Member Roberts makes a very good point, though, doesn't he? On many occasions we've been told, and listening to Keir Starmer himself saying that they've been spending a lot of time preparing. And the point from Assembly Member Roberts is valid if they were, and the Mayor is well and truly in with the leadership, which he tells us he's always been, and that it's going to be apple pie and everything else when the government changes. Surely you've already put your requests in and know with some certainty as to what's going to come back.
We've got to have a realistic view of what the government, the new government has had to take on, which is 14 years of austerity, of absolute decimation, not of just of policing, but of public services. It is not going to change overnight. The new government has been very clear that a focus on growth and the investment that will bring. This is not going to change overnight, and of course we'll have those discussions, but we've got to be realistic that this is going to take time. You cannot just flick a switch and change 14 years of decimation of public services.
Hit the ground running springs to mind. I've heard it so many times.
And indeed they have. They've already been very clear they're going to ban zombie knives. They're going to make spiking a specific offence. They're going to make sure that legislation on online safety, and they're going to be, they're also going to be legislating around shoplifting. Indeed, they have hit the ground running. That is different to being able to absolutely put right 14 years of austerity.
Yes, I hear the words you're parroting there on numerous occasions, but the point is The money has been being asked for a long time. You know you want 240 million.
I would be happy to say things once, but you're asking me the same questions over and over again.
NICC money.
You know, that's what I am doing.
With respect,
I'm answering the questions again and again and again.
We have been listening to the Mayor saying again and again and again, if there was a Labour...
I've answered the questions, but you're saying that I'm repeating myself.
If there was a Labour government, they would give us this, that and the world, basically. We're asking how long it's going to take for that to be given to the Assembly.
I've been really clear about we'll be in discussions. You're going to, again, pick me up on repeating myself, but you are basically asking me the same question, and it's the same answer, that it will take more than overnight to put right 14 years of decimation of public services, including of policing. Of course, we'll be having discussions with the Labour government, and we know that they will be much more supportive in everything that they do than the previous government was.
Well, we'll look forward to the millions and millions and millions of pounds that Sadiq Khan promised us all if there was a Labour government. Were you indicating, Assemblymember Bailey?
Yes, Chair. Yes, I thought you would have to do. You talked about austerity, but you make no recognition of the then incoming coalition government having to deal with the decimation of the public finances by the government before that. So why is it any different? Why is it? I don't want to point out.
You're joking. You're talking about a world economic crisis.
So why is it a world economic crisis when it's your problem, and when it's our problem, it's our fault? Let's be very clear.
Because
left a note.
Brown saved the world economy from world economic crisis.
Well, hold on a second.
I'm sorry, you are really moving away from the remit of the Police and Crime Committee. I'm very happy to have the argument about the economy,
excuse me, Deputy Mayor. You were the one who started talking about austerity and government spending. If you're going to talk about that, then let's talk about the fact that this government had to deal with the pandemic. The point I'm making is, I was going to row to your rescue. I don't think I'll bother now, because I was going to say it isn't reasonable for a 2-week-old government to give complete detail on what they're going to do around police fund. I do think you need to give them more than 2 weeks. I accept that. But I was going to say you need to extend that same sort of analysis to your criticisms of the previous government if you expect us to do it for this government. So let's be very clear. So 2 weeks from now, I will say what's going to happen.
So you're going to compare 2 weeks with 14 years?
No, I'm going to put... And the 13 years you had before that, we absolutely destroyed the finances. You left a note stating
no, excuse me, I'm going to put a stop to this. I'm going to blame Assemblymember Roberts completely.
I take some.
Right, okay, let's move to our next question, which is number 20 on our sheets. Assemblymember Deval.
Thank you, Chair. I take a breath. And I'm just watching. On the Safer Neighbourhood teams, I think you mentioned some statistics earlier on. What measurements are we going to put in place around what success looks like once, given the conditions that they're operating under? Given that, in part of my brief to this question, it says the strongest ever Safer Neighbourhood policing programme. I thought I was part of that in 2004. So it's quite interesting listening to the changes over it. The things that concern me most are one of the problems we grappled with in 2004, mixed messages, what are Safer Neighbourhoods doing. If I ask my Safer Neighbourhood teams on the ground, what do they think they're contributing in terms of tackling crime? Will I get 57 varieties of response, or will I get a very solid response? This is what we do now, and this is how we do it when we're able to do it, when we're not being abstracted.
So I think you should get a combination of the two. Sorry to be sort of sitting on the fence on that, because of course there should be consistency across London, and there will be, and there is consistency in that core neighbourhood offer of 2 dedicated ward officers and 1 PCSO. There should also be consistency in the answer as to, well, what is that going to do? There should be consistency in this is not just about visibility and communities knowing who their officers are. It is also really importantly about problem solving, because you can have visibility, but if you don't solve the problems, that doesn't increase trust and confidence, and neighbourhood policing is absolutely at the core of increasing trust and confidence. It's only going to do it if those neighbourhood police officers are working with the community and with partners to solve the problems that they are, the communities are flagging and raising. So the reason I say it's a combination of the two, it will depend on local circumstances as to what those problems are that they are going to be solving. In response to your question as to how will you measure impact, we do have a performance framework which the London Policing Board will also be advising the Mayor in terms of holding the Met to account, and that within that framework is neighbourhood crimes. We would want to see a decrease in neighbourhood crimes, and that's part of that framework, and that is around the volume crimes. The Commissioner's been really clear that there's issues about balancing the focus on violence and volume crimes and capacity and resources, but that's going to be the performance framework that we are going to be holding the Met to account on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Theft from person offences has risen in London by 39% over the last year. How will the Met's new approach to neighbourhood policing bring that dreadful figure down?
It is a challenge, theft from person and robbery in London, and it is an issue for London, and it is a real challenge. In the Met are very clear that that's a key focus. We've been working with the Met on this around how do they really understand what is happening and where, at what times, and to whom, and who the perpetrators are. I chair a robbery reduction partnership which includes the data and includes theft, because actually your response is pretty similar, whether it's theft or robbery. It's a sort of categorisation of crime reporting that makes the two different categories. So the Met are, over the summer, what they have done, well, not over the summer, they are now operationalising the work that they've done around analysing very hyper-local areas where there are particular issues and really understanding the time. So, for example, in some areas of London, it is about after-school robbery, and it's between the hours of 3 and 6 or 3 and 8. It's really about that. In other parts of London, it's about the nighttime economy. It's about post-midnight and that theft. And so they are moving their resources around. What I'm doing as part of the MOPAC is doing as part of the partnership is to make sure that that partnership is there to support the Met. So, for example, one of the things that we're working with boroughs on is environmental audits. So you can have the police and the visibility and the patrolling and the enforcement, but you can also, as we all know, those of us who have been councillors, and not just councillors, but have been in this business a long time, it matters, the physical environment. So we're also working with boroughs around environmental audits as to are there things that can happen to really just reduce the likelihood of crime, and then to make sure that there are the right responses from probation, for example. Are they tracking those offenders properly, and are they supervising those offenders properly that are robbery and theft offenders? So it's right across the partnership that work's taking place.
Yeah, and working with boroughs, of course, works, because that's why I keep going on about going back to borough-based policing, because each borough is different, and very often you can tailor the needs of the problems within the borough to that particular band of people, as in the borough-based policing. So I will never stop going on about that, because this new system is not working, as we can see by some of these crime stats. There's a 74% increase in business robbery. I mean, that is shocking. Small businesses are on their knees anyway. To suffer the loss of theft from their businesses is just making it impossible for some to carry on. I mean, when are you anticipating, with your new way of doing things, when are you anticipating these numbers will come down? Have you set any KPIs? Can you give us any indication?
I've asked for a trajectory of when, so that we can, as part of oversight, you need to have an understanding of what the trajectory needs to be in terms of, how, if you want to hold people to account, you do need that. And I've asked for that trajectory so that we can look in the months ahead as to are you meeting what you think is going to be a reasonable reduction or not. And that's something I've asked to happen. You talk about businesses, of course, businesses are being, are having real issues. There's the robbery and there's the shoplifting. We did a piece of research recently from MOPAC with, I think it was King's College, I'd have to double check whether it was King's, around the around the cost of living crisis, and then the increases in shoplifting, theft, and violence. So there is a link between that, and there is an impact from cost of living to that. The Robbery Reduction Partnership includes businesses because it's really important for me to make sure that, yes, it's boroughs and working with boroughs, but actually we really got to be working with businesses, and we are working with the business improvement districts and the business crime reduction partnerships, and we have actually mapped to make sure that in those areas that we are most concerned about in London, to look about what is the network of businesses and how can we engage with them and work with them.
Yeah, the trouble is that if you've got the bids, they're very often the bigger companies that are within there and paying into them. It's the little small shops on the corner, etc., that are suffering so badly.
I agree, and we've had correspondence, and I think the Met are meeting soon. I'd have to double check the Association of basically the small businesses and the convenience stores, because they have been talking to us about the impact that they have had on from robbery and shoplifting. Yeah,
the Federation of Small Businesses are an incredible band, but you haven't actually said to me when do you think these figures are going to come down?
Well, I would hope. I mean, Louisa Rolfe talked about at the London Policing Board when she was asked about the neighbourhood policing and the improvements around neighbourhood policing. When she was asked in the London Policing Board when will we see results, and it is through neighbourhood policing mostly that we'll see this. She said within the next 6 months you should start to see it coming down, and you should start to see the Met getting on top of this. So that's something I know the London Policing Board will be making sure that they come back to make sure that to check whether that has happened.
Well, the London Policing Board, of course, has the benefit of the police attending it, unlike the elected members around this table. OK, I'll leave that at there, but we do need to start having proper indicators of that we can hold you account to. The VRU, I'm very thrilled to hear you say that they've now got something in place, because for a couple of years at least we've been asking for KPIs for them, and there weren't any. So, if we're to hold you account, we have to have something to hold you account to, and not having proper dates and things by which time you hope these figures will come down isn't very helpful. But I can see Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you very much, Chair. One of the issues around these theft from person events, or theft in general, do you welcome the changes, and can you tell this committee if there's been any discussion between yourselves and Metropolitan Police about the changes in the shoplifting issues, and particularly not just shoplifting but increasingly with intimidations, threats of violence and violence that's gone on? So the low-level crime of the dropping of the limits of £200. Do you think that we will address what's going on across the nation, but it's also happening here in London in terms of some of the shop premises of going on? But do you think the Metropolitan Police will take these matters seriously? Because the public doesn't think they do, and nor do shop staff, who have to put up with the increasing intimidation and violence.
I do welcome a focus on this, and especially a focus on the violence that shop workers are having to experience. I mean, I've had many conversations with, and I've been to meet shop workers, and as part of sort of round tables about the violence that they are having to experience. It's a real terrible sort of. It's terrible, isn't it, that we were clapping the shop workers during COVID, and those very people are actually subject to quite a lot of violent attacks now. I do welcome that, and I welcome the focus that will have, because it's really important. And as you said, Susan, a lot of these shop workers are in very small local shops. It's not as if they're businesses coming from outside. They are local people running local businesses, and they are being impacted by violence, and they're being impacted by shoplifting as well. So it does flow into trust and confidence of Londoners if there isn't a proper response.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one question very quickly.
Just around the theft from person, I just wondered what research and investigations the Met's doing into the driving factors, because I know that in my local, in Hackney, they were talking about how young people were often driven by a number of factors. So wanting, the drive to have control over people, the drive to want the things. So I just wondered if that's a piece of work that's happening across the Met, looking at the drivers of these crimes. Thanks.
Yes, it is, in terms of looking at what is going on with and what is being stolen, what happens to the thing that is stolen, and what happened, why certain individuals or groups are part of that crime. It is, and in particular working with mobile phone companies around what is happening to those mobile phones. We had a round table at the beginning of the year where we had quite a few of the mobile phone companies there, and we asked them to do some work with the Met around what happens to those phones. That's been analysed at the moment. When we have that research back, we will reconvene that round table, and we will probably reconvene it with the new government, because they will work with us on this, and that will be really helpful in terms of having the heft of government behind us with working with the mobile phone companies. But it is also looking at, particularly around those thefts and robberies that are happening around schools and after school. It is also looking at why that is happening, what is happening with the young people. Are they being, is this a gateway crime, or is it a crime that you have to prove yourself? What is happening? And the Mayor has also invested through the Violence Reduction Unit in looking at, well, how can we support young people away from this crime? And will be, shortly there'll be announcements on where that funding is going, working with young people to divert them and support them.
Thank you. We have one question left, and because my dear friend Caroline Pidgeon is no longer here with us, it falls to Assembly Member Roberts.
Big shoes to fill. Big shoes. Can you provide an update on the publication of the Met's estate strategy?
To be fair, that wasn't one that Caroline always asked. It was more Tony Devonish, I think.
We've all asked.
I prefer the former.
But with respect, we've all asked numerous times.
I would absolutely. Yeah, every single member of this committee has asked me, and I think again, I apologies. It is still being worked on. There are a number of issues that are going through. I would hope to get it. I mean, I haven't got a timeline on the estate strategy at the moment. It's something that is being worked through with the Met.
It is taking in.
I know. I can't. I'm sorry. I
know. But the whole one of the major responsibilities of the Police and Crime Commissioner is to ensure an effective and an effective and efficient police service. How can we possibly have an effective and efficient police service if we are waiting months, years, possibly getting on for a decade? Well, maybe not a decade, but it's nudging it, simply to get a basic document so that we can all look at, so that we can all say we are going to have the Met which London needs going forward, so that we can see which buildings are needed, which buildings are not needed, whether money can be freed up in order to provide social housing, for example, whether that capital receipts from that can go into providing more frontline officers. I mean, we all have a laugh about the estate strategy. It's fundamental, and it's something which needs doing. So could we possibly put a time scale when we will have an indicative first glance, maybe by the end of the year?
So I agree with you. It is really important, and we shouldn't laugh, really, but it has been so long in the development of it. I agree with you. It is really important that we have clarity over what happens to the buildings, because it's not just about the buildings, is it? It's about the revenue costs those buildings have. It is about the capital costs those buildings have, and what capital can be freed up for the Met. I don't think it's, disposals have been put on hold, but it's not that there is no work being undertaken on the estates and the buildings. There are still some decisions coming through in terms of buildings that need really significant work. There are still, it's not totally solidified, but I agree with you. It is really important. It is something we've asked for on numerous occasions. We are working with the Met. But I do think, to be fair to the Met, it is it is complex. Two, there have been great sort of shifts in what is happening with the Met. One being going down below 30,000 and then gearing up, which is welcomed, to more police officers. So the estate has to, flex around that. The second thing being, we had a new commissioner, nearly 2 years ago, but he wanted to look, and rightly so, to make sure that the estate was able to support and help him deliver his new Met for London plan.
Thank you for that. And I agree. It is. We should be taking it more seriously, and it's easy to be lightly flippant. Do you think it might be possible that we could have an in-person briefing for this committee with the chair's agreement from the officer tasked with drawing up, because they may be able to answer individual questions which perhaps you don't have the full sight on. So would you be able to arrange that for us?
So I think it would be possible to have a briefing from the property services from the Met with the MOPAC, absolutely, but it won't be to answer any specific questions on the future of specific buildings, because those decisions haven't been taken. But of course, I don't see why you can't have a briefing on these are the aspects and principles, this is the framework we're working on. But yeah, it won't be about individual buildings.
Something will be better than nothing. Thank you.
No? Right. Okay. And it is ridiculous. You must have some clouds with this, because we do ask on so many occasions, and we really must have this because we need to know. One of my questions was around the fact that officers have to move to get on buses to get where they need to be. We need some sort of idea of whether this is going to carry on, or whether we can actually have our police officers amongst the community they're policing, because that obviously would make a big difference. Okay. Very quickly.
Really quickly, Sophie, do you know how many officers or staff are tasked with the Met Estate strategy, and what time is dedicated to working on it? And would you also be able to provide the contacts to this committee of those specific people that are tasked with leading on the estate strategy?
So I don't have off the top of my head how many people are within property services. No, I don't. I'm sure that's something that the Met would be happy to provide for you.
Great, that's lovely. There's a lot to provide there. I'll make sure it all goes in a letter to you to make sure that we get answers to everything that we've asked for. So I'd like to thank you, Sophie, for attending this morning and for answering our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report in the discussion? Thank you. Can we note the monthly reports from MOPAC, and can we delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Agreed. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 24-25 Assembly year and meeting dates agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 10th of May 24? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday the 11th of September at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.